Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never should have gone hiking alone. That's what everyone tells you, right? But I thought I knew better. I was an experienced hiker after all. I'd tackled parts of the Appalachian Trail before, always with friends or organized groups. This time was different. This time, I wanted to prove something to myself. I never imagined that my solo adventure would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was late September, and the Appalachian Mountains were alive with the vibrant colors of autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and pine needles. I had been on the trail for 3 days, reveling in the solitude and the raw beauty of nature. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional cry of a bird, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, on that fateful 4th day, I decided to push on a little further before making camp. The fading light painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed, how perfectly still. That's when I first heard it, a sound so subtle that at first I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the lumbering gait of a bear, but something different. They were rhythmic, purposeful, bipedal. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped too. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt very exposed on the narrow trail. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just an echo of my own footsteps, or maybe another hiker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I started walking again, a little faster this time. The footsteps resumed, matching my pace. They were behind me, but I couldn't tell how far. Every instinct screamed at me not to look back, to just keep moving forward. The sun was sinking faster now, the shadows growing longer and darker. My heart was pounding in my chest as I picked up the pace even more. The footsteps behind me quickened too, growing slightly louder. Whatever was following me was getting closer. I clutched my trekking poles tighter, ready to use them as weapons if I had to. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I spotted a small clearing up ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I needed to make camp and fast. The light was fading quickly, and I didn't want to be caught on the trail in complete darkness with whatever that thing was still following me. I practically ran into the clearing, quickly shrugging off my backpack and fumbling for my tent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the zippers. All the while, I was listening intently for those footsteps. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a twig snapping at the edge of the clearing. My head whipped around, and that's when I saw it. In the dim twilight, partially obscured by the trees, stood a figure. It was massive, far taller than any man I'd ever seen, and it was covered in dark, matted fur. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The creature stood perfectly still, watching me. I could feel its gaze boring into me, predatory and intelligent. This was no bear. This was something else entirely. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. Those were just myths, campfire stories. They weren't real, but the creature before me was undeniably real and undeniably terrifying. Suddenly, it took a step forward, emerging further from the tree line. In the fading light, I could make out more details. Its arms were impossibly long, ending in massive hands with curved claws. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape-like features, with eyes that reflected the last remnants of daylight. That's when I snapped out of my paralysis. Pure, primal fear took over, and I ran. I abandoned my backpack, my tent, everything. I just ran as fast as I could down the trail, my lungs burning and branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Its gait was long and loping, covering ground much faster than I could. I knew I couldn't outrun it, not on the uneven terrain of the trail. I had to find another way. In desperation, I veered off the path, plunging into the dense forest. I had no idea where I was going, but I hoped the thick vegetation might slow the creature down. I ducked under low-hanging branches and leapt over fallen logs, driven by sheer adrenaline. The sound of pursuit was constant, sometimes fading slightly, only to grow louder again. The creature let out a roar that shook me to my core, a sound that was part howl, part scream, and wholly inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I ran, my legs aching and my lungs feeling like they were about to burst. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that terrifying chase, but eventually I saw a glimmer of hope. Through the trees I spotted the flickering glow of a campfire. Civilization, safety. With the last of my strength, I sprinted towards the light. I burst into a small campsite, startling a group of hikers gathered around the fire. I must have looked like a madwoman, wild-eyed and breathless, twigs and leaves tangled in my hair. "Help!" I gasped, collapsing to my knees. It's chasing me." The hikers jumped to their feet, alarmed. One of them, a tall man with a beard, helped me up while the others peered anxiously into the darkness beyond their campfire's glow. "What's chasing you?" the bearded man asked, his voice filled with concern. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I had seen? Who would believe me? As the adrenaline began to wear off, doubt started to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Just then, we all heard it. A long, mournful howl echoed through the forest, unlike anything any of us had ever heard before. It was distant now, but unmistakably the same creature that had been pursuing me. The other hikers looked at each other in confusion and fear. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. I shook my head, still struggling to catch my breath. I don't know, but it was chasing me. It was huge, and it was walking on two legs, and I trailed off, seeing the skepticism in their eyes. But the bearded man nodded slowly. "I've heard stories," he said quietly. "Old legends about creatures in these mountains, things that shouldn't exist but somehow do." We stayed up all night, huddled around the campfire. No one slept. We heard the howl a few more times, always in the distance, but it was enough to keep us all on edge. When dawn finally broke, the bearded man and one of his friends hiked back with me to retrieve my abandoned gear. Everything was still there, untouched. There were no monstrous footprints, no sign at all of the creature I had seen. If it weren't for the other hikers hearing that howl, I might have convinced myself it was all a stress-induced hallucination. I cut my solo hike short after that, heading to the nearest town and catching a bus home. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to explain it away, but deep down I know what I saw. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilized world. I still hike, but never alone. And whenever I'm in the woods and the sun starts to set, I can't help but listen for those footsteps, because I know they're out there, watching and waiting. And I hope I never encounter them again. Story 2. We were miles from civilization, deep in the woods where the trees grow so thick they blot out the moonlight. I always loved camping in places like this. The more remote, the better. I craved that disconnect from the world, that feeling of being totally engulfed in nature. But as the fire crackled in the center of our small clearing, an unease settled over me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like we weren't alone. It was the 4th night of our trip, and everything had been perfect up to that point. The air was crisp and fresh, and the stars burned brightly overhead, a tapestry of pinpricks against the vast black sky. My friends and I had set up camp near a creek that wound through the forest, thinking it would be the perfect spot to unwind. Earlier that evening, we sat around the fire laughing, telling stories, passing around a bottle of whiskey to warm ourselves against the cool night air. As the night wore on, a strange silence descended around us. The laughter died down, and I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, had all but disappeared. It was as if the entire woods had taken a breath and were holding it, waiting for something to happen. I glanced around at my friends, who were staring into the fire, clearly feeling the same shift in atmosphere. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at each of us, her eyes wide and glinting in the firelight. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to sound calm, but my heartbeat quickened as I strained my ears. At first, there was nothing, just the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop of a burning log. Then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs snapping just beyond the tree line. It was faint, almost like a large animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound made my skin crawl. The forest was dense, and the darkness between the trees was thick and impenetrable, even with the firelight. We couldn't see anything out there. "Probably just a deer," Mark muttered, trying to ease the tension, but there was a crack in his voice that made it clear he didn't believe his own words. We'd all been camping in these woods enough times to recognize the movements of common wildlife. This felt different, deliberate, calculated, like something was watching us. We all sat there, frozen, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flickering circle of light cast by our campfire. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself that whatever it was had moved on. But then the snapping resumed, this time louder, closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless rows of trees. I swung the light back and forth, searching for a hint of movement, a glint of eyes reflecting the light. Nothing. "Okay, this is getting freaky," Jess said, standing up and dusting off her jeans. "Maybe we should call it a night." "Yeah," I agreed, lowering the flashlight. "Let's just get some sleep. We'll pack up and head out first thing in the morning." Reluctantly, we put out the fire, doused it with water until it hissed and sputtered, and retreated into our tents. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipping it up tightly around me, as if the thin fabric could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. My ears were on high alert, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The forest was deathly silent now. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, as I lay there, staring up at the darkened ceiling of the tent. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, a faint rustle, a soft thump, and my eyes would snap open again. Hours passed like this. My phone said it was nearly 3 a.m. when I finally began to relax, exhaustion tugging at my consciousness. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were unmistakably close, right outside the tent, heavy, deliberate, moving with a purpose. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps circled around the tent, slow and methodical, pausing now and then as if whatever it was listening, waiting. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my skin cold and clammy despite the warmth of the sleeping bag. Then came the scratching, a low, grating sound like claws dragging lightly against the nylon of the tent wall. It moved in a slow, deliberate arc from one side of the tent to the other. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it was just a raccoon or a bear, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. This was something else, something that walked on 2 legs. "Mark," I whispered as loudly as I dared. "Jess, are you awake?" Silence. I didn't dare call out again, not wanting to draw attention. I had to think, had to do something. But fear had locked my body in place. The scratching stopped, and for a few heartbeats, there was nothing but the sound of my own rapid breathing. Then came a new sound, one that turned my blood to ice. A low, guttural growl, so deep it resonated through the ground beneath me. It was right outside my tent, so close I could hear the wetness in its throat. I covered my mouth with my hands, trying to stifle my panicked breathing. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, and all I could think was, we should have left. We should have never come here. The growling grew louder, vibrating through the thin fabric of the tent. I could hear it sniffing, inhaling deeply as it moved around the tent, searching for a way in. The sound of it, the sheer wrongness of it, made my stomach churn. I lay there, paralyzed, as it circled again, each step bringing it closer and closer to the entrance of the tent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The growling ceased, the footsteps faded, and once again there was silence. I waited, heart pounding in my ears, for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the forest canopy, I dared to unzip my sleeping bag and crawl toward the tent's door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to unzip the flap. I poked my head out cautiously, scanning the campsite. The fire pit was a pile of cold ashes, and the trees loomed silently around us. Nothing moved. I crawled out of the tent, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. I crept toward Jess and Mark's tents, gently calling their names. They emerged, looking as pale and terrified as I felt. "Did you hear it?" Jess whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "That growling." I nodded, feeling a knot of fear twist in my stomach. "Yeah, it was right outside my tent." We stood there, glancing around nervously, half expecting whatever it was to return. The forest around us was eerily calm, the early morning light filtering through the trees in soft, golden rays. For a moment, it almost felt normal again, like the horrors of the night had been some kind of collective nightmare. "Look at this," Mark muttered, pointing to the ground. We followed his gaze and my heart sank. Large, deep footprints, clawed and unmistakably canine, encircled our campsite. They were too large and too distinct to be anything from the local wildlife. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." No one argued. We packed up our gear in a frenzy, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending jolts of fear through us. As we trekked back toward the trailhead, none of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and lingering terror. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the main road that I finally looked back. For a split second, I thought I saw something large and dark standing just within the tree line, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the whispering of the leaves in the wind. We never spoke of that night again, not really. But every time I find myself in the woods, I can't help but remember that feeling, that sense of being hunted, of something intelligent and malevolent lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. It's a memory that haunts me still, one that has made me question what really lives in the deep, dark forests of the world. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear the wind howling outside my window, I swear I can still hear that low, guttural growl. Story 3. The first howl pierced the air like a knife, sending chills down my spine and silencing the usual nighttime chorus of Yellowstone. It wasn't a wolf, I'd know that sound anywhere. This was something different, something wrong. That's when I knew this night patrol would be unlike any other in my 10 years as a park ranger. My name's Mike, and I've seen a lot in my time at Yellowstone. Bear encounters, lost hikers, even the occasional poacher. But nothing could have prepared me for what my partner Sarah and I were about to face. It started as a routine call. Visitors at a campground reported strange noises in the night, describing them as unearthly howls. We get calls like this sometimes, city folk spooked by the unfamiliar sounds of the wild. But there was an urgency in the camp host's voice that made us take it seriously. Sarah and I loaded up our truck and headed out, just as dusk was settling over the park. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the dark pines that lined the road. As we drove, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. "You hear about the missing hikers?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. I nodded. 2 backpackers had vanished without a trace a week ago. The search and rescue had found no sign of them. "You think it's related?" Sarah shrugged, her eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't know, but something feels off." We arrived at the campground just as true darkness fell. The camp host, a nervous man named Jerry, met us at the entrance. His flashlight beam danced erratically as he spoke. "It started 3 nights ago," he said, voice quavering. "These howls, like nothing I've ever heard. And campers keep reporting shadows, moving just outside the light of their fires. Big shadows." I tried to reassure him, but my words felt hollow even to me. We decided to do a sweep of the area surrounding the campground. As we moved into the forest, the dense canopy above seemed to swallow up the beam of our flashlights. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when Sarah suddenly stopped, crouching down. "Ah, Mike," she whispered. "Look at this." I knelt beside her, my flashlight illuminating the forest floor. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any I'd seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with clear impressions of massive claws at the end of each toe. "What the hell made that?" Sarah breathed. Before I could answer, that howl split the night again. It was closer this time, and now that I heard it clearly, I realized why it had sounded so wrong before. It started low, almost like a wolf, but then rose to a pitch that was almost human, a wailing, mournful sound that made my hair stand on end. We both stood, instinctively moving closer together. "We should head back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd call in some backup." Sarah nodded, but as we turned to leave, a branch snapped loudly somewhere in the darkness behind us. We spun around, flashlights searching frantically. That's when we saw them. Eyes. Dozens of eyes reflecting our light, surrounding us in a wide circle. They were too high off the ground to be wolves, and too close together to be bears. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm. We took off, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear movement all around us, keeping pace effortlessly. Whatever these things were, they were fast. We burst into a small clearing, panting heavily. For a moment, I thought we'd lost them. Then Sarah's flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Claw marks, deep gouges in the trunk of a massive pine tree, easily 15 feet off the ground. No known animal in Yellowstone could have made those marks. A low growl rumbled from the edge of the clearing. Slowly, hesitantly, we turned our lights toward the sound. It emerged from the shadows like something out of a nightmare, easily 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy dark fur. Its face was a grotesque mixture of wolf and human features, with an elongated snout full of gleaming teeth. But its eyes were terrifyingly intelligent. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature. Then it tilted back its head and let out that bone-chilling howl. The spell broke. We ran again, no longer caring about direction, just desperate to get away. I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls behind us, getting closer with each stride. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. We'd run right off the edge of a steep embankment. We tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and gear, finally coming to a stop at the bottom. Dazed, I looked up. The creature stood at the top of the embankment, its massive silhouette blocking out the stars, but it didn't follow us down. Instead, it let out another howl, this one sounding almost mournful, before melting back into the forest. Sarah and I lay there for a long time, too shocked and terrified to move. When we finally made it back to our truck, we sat in silence for a while, neither of us sure what to say. "We can't report this," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew she was right. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the service, maybe even lose our jobs, but we couldn't just ignore what we'd seen either. Over the next few weeks, we did our own investigation. We found more tracks, more claw marks. We interviewed campers and hikers, piecing together a pattern of sightings and strange occurrences. And we heard those howls again, always in the distance, always at night. We never saw the creature as clearly as we did that first night. But sometimes, on late patrols, I'd catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my flashlight beam. A flash of eyes reflecting in the darkness, a shadow that seemed too large to be natural. The official report we filed was vague, unidentified large animal, possible threat to campers, increased patrols recommended. But Sarah and I knew the truth. There was something out there in the wilds of Yellowstone, something that shouldn't exist, but did. Months passed. The sightings became less frequent, but they never stopped entirely. The missing hikers were never found. Life in the park mostly returned to normal, but things had changed for Sarah and me. We viewed the wilderness differently now, with a mix of awe and fear that hadn't been there before. One night, almost a year after our encounter, Sarah and I were sitting by a campfire after a long day of patrolling. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees around us, and for a moment I could almost imagine we were back in that clearing, face to face with the unexplainable. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah said quietly, "if we really saw what we think we saw?" I poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling up into the night sky. "All the time," I admitted, "but then I remember those eyes, that howl, and I know it was real." Sarah nodded slowly. "What do you think it was? Some kind of undiscovered species?" I shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe it's something that's always been here, hiding just out of sight, something that only shows itself when it wants to." We fell into silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Then, faintly, carried on the wind, we heard it, that unmistakable howl, equal parts wolf and human, echoing through the vast wilderness of Yellowstone. Sarah and I locked eyes across the fire. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew that our encounter hadn't been a one-time thing. The creature, or creatures, were still out there, roaming the wild places of the park. As I lay in my tent that night, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. Yellowstone had always been a place of wonder, but now it held a new mystery, one that Sarah and I were determined to unravel, no matter how long it took or where it led us. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you can never go back to believing in a world without monsters. All you can do is keep your eyes open, your wits about you, and hope that next time you're ready for whatever emerges from the shadows. Story 4. I've been a fisherman all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that moonless night on Lake Champlain. It was supposed to be a simple night fishing trip, a chance to catch some walleye and enjoy the solitude. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. My name's Jack, and I've lived near Lake Champlain my whole life. I know its moods, its secrets, or at least I thought I did. That night changed everything. It was a perfect late summer evening when I set out. The air was cool and still, with just a hint of autumn crispness. I loaded up my small boat with my gear, looking forward to a peaceful night on the water. If only I'd known what was waiting out there in the darkness. I motored out to my favorite spot about a half-mile from shore. The lake was calm, like black glass stretching out in all directions. I cut the engine and let the boat drift. The only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the occasional splash of a jumping fish. As night fell, I set up my gear. The soft glow of my headlamp was the only light for miles. I baited my hook and cast out, settling in for what I hoped would be a productive night. Hours passed. I caught a few decent-sized walleye, nothing spectacular. Around midnight, I was considering calling it a night when I noticed something odd. My headlamp was reflecting off something in the water, maybe 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was just the eyes of a curious deer or raccoon on the distant shore. But then I realized the reflections were too far out to be on land, and they were moving. I focused my light on the spot, trying to get a better look. Two eyes, glowing an eerie greenish yellow, stared back at me. They were huge, much larger than any fish or other aquatic animal I'd ever seen in the lake, and they were watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably just a big catfish, maybe a sturgeon. Lake Champlain was known for its monster legends. Old Champ, they called it, but I'd always scoffed at those stories. Now, faced with those unblinking eyes, I wasn't so sure. Suddenly, the eyes disappeared beneath the surface. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe it was nothing after all, just my imagination running wild in the dark. Then I heard it, a splash, much larger than a jumping fish. Something was moving through the water, heading straight for my boat. I swung my light around frantically, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The beam of my headlamp caught something breaking the surface about 20 yards out. At first, all I saw was a dark shape, sleek and much larger than any fish I'd ever seen. But as it got closer, I started to make out details that sent my heart racing. It wasn't a fish. The head that emerged from the water was all wrong. Too large, too human-like, but distorted, with a wide, lipless mouth and those same glowing eyes I'd seen before. The skin was a mottled grey-green, slick and shiny in my light. I sat frozen in terror as the creature continued to approach. It was using its arms to swim, powerful strokes that propelled it through the water with frightening speed. Arms, not fins. Arms with long, webbed fingers ending in wickedly sharp claws. As it got closer, more of its body became visible. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet long. The torso was vaguely humanoid, but the lower half tapered into a powerful tail. It looked like some nightmarish fusion of human and fish, something that had no right to exist in the real world. The creature circled my small boat, those unblinking eyes never leaving me. I could hear its heavy breathing, see the gills on its neck fluttering. A low growl emanated from its throat, a sound that vibrated through the hull of the boat. My paralysis finally broke. I lunged for the motor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the starter cord. The creature let out a shriek that curdled my blood, a sound somewhere between a woman's scream and the roar of an alligator. I yanked the cord, praying to every god I could think of for the engine to start. The motor sputtered once, twice, but wouldn't catch. The creature was right next to the boat now, one clawed hand reaching for the gunwale. In desperation, I grabbed my fishing rod and swung it with all my might. The heavy handle connected with the creature's head with a sickening thud. It let out another shriek, this one clearly of pain, and disappeared beneath the surface. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I pulled the starter cord again, and this time, mercifully, the engine roared to life. I opened the throttle wide, not caring which direction I was going as long as it was away from that thing. As I sped across the lake, I kept looking back, terrified I'd see the creature in pursuit. But the water behind me remained empty. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw the lights of the shore and aimed for them like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. I beached the boat hard, not even bothering to properly dock it. I just needed to be on solid ground. I stumbled up the beach, my legs wobbly from fear and adrenaline. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I finally allowed myself to believe I was safe. As I sat there in the cab, trying to slow my racing heart, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It was impossible. There was no way something like that could exist, let alone in Lake Champlain. I'd grown up hearing the Champ stories, but I'd always dismissed them as tall tales. Now, I wasn't so sure. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon when I finally worked up the courage to return to my boat. In the grey light of dawn, it all seemed like a bad dream, but the evidence was there, my broken fishing rod, deep scratches in the side of the boat where the creature had grabbed it. I'd thought about reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of town, maybe even accused of drinking on the water. So I kept quiet, but I couldn't forget. In the weeks that followed, I scoured old newspapers and local history books, looking for any similar accounts. I found more than I expected, stories going back centuries of strange creatures seen in the lake. Most were vague, easily dismissed. But a few described something eerily similar to what I'd encountered. I haven't been night fishing since. I still go out on the lake during the day, but never alone, and never after dark. Some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear strange sounds carrying across the water, splashes too big to be fish, and sometimes what sounds like that same unearthly shriek. I don't know what's really out there in the depths of Lake Champlain. Maybe it was some unknown species, a relic from prehistoric times. Maybe it was something else entirely, something science can't explain. All I know is that the lake holds secrets, and some of them have teeth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself standing on the shore, staring out at the dark water. Part of me is still terrified, remembering those glowing eyes and reaching claws. But another part, a part I'm not entirely comfortable with, feels drawn to the mystery. What else is out there, hiding just beneath the surface? What other impossible things are waiting to be discovered? I don't know if I'll ever go night fishing again, but I do know that I'll never look at Lake Champlain the same way. It's not just a lake anymore. It's a frontier, a place where the line between the known and the unknown blurs. And somewhere out there, in the black depths, something waits. Something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, when the night is dark and the water is still, I swear I can see a pair of eyes watching me from just beyond the shore, reminding me that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 5. There are places in the forest where you don't belong. It's like the trees know it, the wind knows it, even the earth beneath your feet knows it. They warn you, try to drive you away with an unsettling silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. But I didn't heed those warnings the day I hiked the mountain trail, and it's a mistake I'll never forget. The trail was supposed to be a challenge. I was alone, which is exactly how I liked it. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness stretching out for miles. I had taken a few days off from work, hoping to clear my mind and reset with some solitude in nature. The trail was known for its incredible ridge views, but also for being isolated. Only experienced hikers ever bothered to attempt it, and that's what drew me there. The climb started off normal enough. Birds chirped from the trees overhead, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves. I could feel the sunlight filtering through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with shifting patches of light. The forest felt alive, vibrant even, but as I ascended, that changed. About halfway up the mountain, I noticed the first signs. The birdsong faded until there was nothing but the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The usual forest noises, the hum of insects, the distant rustling of small animals, fell silent. An uneasy feeling settled into the pit of my stomach, but I brushed it off as pre-hike nerves. I continued to climb, pushing myself up the narrow path, using my walking stick to help balance on the steep, rocky sections. The air grew cooler as I gained altitude, a dampness hanging in the breeze. I reached a bend in the trail that led to a small ridge, a spot where the trees parted, revealing a stunning view of the valley below. But something wasn't right. There, on the ridge, was an almost unnatural quiet. I stood still, catching my breath, and looked out over the valley. The scenery was breathtaking, a sea of treetops stretching to the horizon under a clear blue sky, but I couldn't enjoy it. My gaze was pulled to the darkened line of trees just beyond the ridge, where shadows clustered unnaturally, deep and foreboding. Then I heard it, a faint, distant whooping noise that sent a shiver down my spine. It echoed off the ridge and seemed to bounce around the valley, distorting in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its origin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix of a howl and a guttural growl, but the strangest part was the rhythm. It felt intentional, deliberate, like a call or a warning. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that it could be an animal, some large bird, or maybe the wind, but even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. My instinct screamed at me that this was wrong, that I should turn back and leave the ridge immediately. And yet, I stayed. I don't know why I kept climbing, but something compelled me to move forward, to continue up the narrow, rocky path that wound higher along the mountainside. The sense of unease grew with each step. The trees lining the trail seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whooping sound came again, this time closer, and I felt a surge of icy fear wash over me. I wasn't alone. My steps slowed as I rounded a bend, and that's when I saw it. Across the trail, about 50 feet ahead, stood a massive, shadowy figure. It was partially obscured by the trees, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human, or any animal I recognized. My breath hitched in my throat as I took in its height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, towering over the underbrush. Its form was bulky, covered in what looked like matted fur, and its head seemed to rest directly on its broad shoulders, without a visible neck. It was just standing there, swaying slightly from side to side, watching me. My mind raced, struggling to process what I was seeing. Bear, no, too upright. Human, no, too big. Then the word forced itself into my thoughts. An unwelcome guest. Sasquatch. The creature shifted, and I caught a glimpse of its eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed intently on me. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a fleeting encounter with a wild animal. It was an assessment, a calculation. It was deciding something. My instincts screamed at me to back away, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure as it swayed, its movements almost hypnotic. A low, rumbling sound started in its chest, a noise that vibrated through the air and rattled in my bones. It wasn't a growl exactly, it was something deeper, more resonant, a warning. The spell broke, and I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the rocky trail. My heart was racing, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped my walking stick. I took another step back, and the creature mirrored me, shifting its weight forward slightly. It didn't move toward me, but the message was clear. Leave. I turned and started down the trail, walking at first, then breaking into a jog as panic surged through me. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I had to get away, but I also had to stay calm, had to focus. The forest around me blurred as I sped downhill, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. For a few minutes, I thought I was putting distance between us, that I might make it out unscathed, but then I heard it behind me, the heavy thump of footsteps that weren't my own. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, the shadowy figure now moving down the trail, not running, but striding with an effortless, ground-covering gait. My breath hitched as adrenaline surged, and I pushed myself to go faster, not caring about the uneven ground beneath my feet. Branches whipped against my arms and face as I careened down the trail. I could hear it gaining on me, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs growing louder with each step. It wasn't rushing, but it didn't need to. It was like a predator toying with its prey, letting me tire myself out. I rounded a corner and spotted a fallen log across the path. In a split-second decision, I scrambled over it, hoping to put some kind of barrier between us. I stumbled on the other side, nearly falling, but managed to keep my balance. My lungs burned, and I gasped for air, glancing back again. It had stopped. The creature was standing on the trail just beyond the log, watching me with those dark, piercing eyes. It made no move to cross, but its presence was a heavy, oppressive force that filled the forest around me. It lifted its head slightly, emitting that low, rumbling sound again, and I felt the vibration in my chest. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted, sprinting down the path as fast as I could, adrenaline giving my legs strength I didn't know they had. The forest passed by in a blur, and I barely registered the pain of branches clawing at my skin. I ran and ran until I saw the trailhead up ahead, the outline of my car just visible through the trees. Bursting into the clearing, I nearly collapsed against the vehicle, my hands fumbling for the keys. I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the forest, but there was nothing. The woods stood silent, the trees still as if nothing had happened. I unlocked the car, threw my pack inside, and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I wasted no time, peeling out of the lot and speeding down the dirt road. As the forest receded in the rearview mirror, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I could still feel its eyes on me, could still hear that deep, resonant rumble echoing in my ears. The creature had let me go, but I knew I had been warned. The mountain belonged to it, and it didn't want visitors. I haven't been back to that trail since. Every now and then, I'll hear a story about strange noises in the forest, or an unexplained sighting in the mountains, and I'll feel that cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I don't know what it was that I saw on that ridge, but I know one thing for certain. There are places in the wilderness that are not meant for us. And when the forest goes silent, it's already too late. You've crossed into its territory, and it's watching you. Story 6. The first knock came just after midnight. A sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the forest, silencing the nocturnal chorus of insects and birds. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances around the dying embers of our campfire. That's when we knew our carefree camping trip had taken a terrifying turn. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Alex, his girlfriend Mia, and my younger brother Tim. We'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the city and enjoy the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. None of us could have imagined the horror that awaited us in those dark woods. The day had started perfectly. We'd hiked deep into the forest, far from the usual tourist trails, to a secluded spot Alex had discovered on a previous trip. The location was breathtaking. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal-clear stream nearby. We set up camp, spent the afternoon exploring, and as night fell, gathered around the fire to roast marshmallows and share stories. It was Tim who first noticed something was off. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Did anyone secure the food cache?" We all looked at each other, realization dawning. In our excitement to start the fire and relax, we'd forgotten one of the cardinal rules of camping in bear country, properly storing our food. "I'll go check," I volunteered, grabbing my flashlight. But as soon as I stepped away from the fire's glow, I knew something was wrong. Our food cache, which we'd hastily hung from a tree branch, was in ruins. The bag was shredded, its contents strewn across the forest floor. "What the hell?" Alex muttered as the others joined me. We surveyed the damage, our minds racing. "Must have been a bear," Mia suggested, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. That's when Tim pointed out the tracks. In the soft earth around the scattered food, we saw footprints, but they weren't bear tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and distinctly humanoid in shape. "You guys," Tim whispered, his face pale in the flashlight's beam. "What made these?" Before anyone could answer, we heard it. That first knock, loud and clear, coming from the darkness beyond our campsite. We huddled closer together, straining our eyes against the impenetrable black of the forest. "Maybe it's another camper," Mia suggested hopefully, but we all knew that was unlikely. We were miles from any official campground or trail. Then came another knock, from a different direction, and another. Soon the sounds were coming from all around us, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to close in on our small circle of light. "We need to leave," Alex said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." We scrambled to break camp, our hands shaking as we tried to quickly pack our gear. The knocking continued, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but never stopping. It was maddening, like some twisted game of Marco Polo played by unseen forces in the darkness. As I was shoving my sleeping bag into its stuff sack, my flashlight beam caught something at the edge of our campsite. For a split second, I saw a huge, dark shape moving between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in what looked like shaggy fur. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Did you see that?" I hissed to the others. Their wide-eyed, terrified expressions told me they had. We abandoned any pretense of packing neatly, just shoving everything we could into our backpacks. The knocking was getting louder, closer. And now there were other sounds. The crack of breaking branches, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, just as we were about to make a run for it. Tim let out a strangled cry. "The trail," he gasped, pointing with a shaking hand. "It's gone." We all looked. Where there had been a clear path leading away from our campsite, there was now only dense forest. Somehow, in the darkness and our panic, we'd become completely turned around. We were lost. The realization hit us like a physical blow. We were trapped, surrounded by unknown creatures in a suddenly alien forest. The knocking reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What do we do?" Mia sobbed, clinging to Alex. That's when I remembered the emergency flare in my pack. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. "Cover your eyes!" I shouted, striking the flare. The world exploded into harsh red light. For a moment, the forest was illuminated as bright as day, and in that moment, we saw them. They were everywhere, dozens of them, surrounding our campsite. Huge, ape-like creatures covered in dark fur. Their faces were a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with deep-set eyes that reflected the flare's light like cats' eyes. Some were perched in the trees, others stood on the ground, all of them frozen in shock at the sudden light. We ran. There was no plan, no direction, just blind panic driving us to flee. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, we could hear them giving chase, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that terrifying flight through the dark forest, but eventually, mercifully, we burst out onto a dirt road. In the distance, we could see headlights approaching. We flagged down the truck, babbling our story to the bewildered forest ranger behind the wheel. He was skeptical, to say the least, but he agreed to drive us back to the ranger station. As we piled into the truck, I glanced back at the forest. In the glow of the tail lights, I swore I saw several pairs of eyes watching us from between the trees. The rangers searched the area the next day, but found nothing unusual. No giant footprints, no signs of our campsite, not even the trail we'd followed into the woods. If it weren't for our muddy, torn clothes and wide-eyed terror, there would have been no evidence that anything had happened at all. We didn't talk much about that night in the weeks that followed. What was there to say? We'd experienced something impossible, something that defied explanation. We'd glimpsed a world hidden just beyond the veil of what we considered reality, and that knowledge changed us. I've been back to those woods since then. Not to camp, never again to camp, but to stand at the edge of the tree line and listen. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest is quiet, I hear it. A faint, rhythmic knocking, echoing from deep within the shadows of the ancient pines. I don't know what's really out there in the wilderness. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species of primate. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that they're real, and they're watching. They've probably been watching us for centuries, staying hidden, revealing themselves only when they choose to. Sometimes I wonder why they let us go that night. They could have easily overwhelmed us, done whatever they wanted, but they didn't. Maybe it was the flare that scared them off, or maybe they were just curious, testing us, seeing how we'd react. I've become something of an amateur researcher since that night, digging into old reports and legends. I found more stories like ours than I ever expected, tales of encounters with giant, ape-like creatures in forests all over the world. Most people dismiss these accounts as hoaxes or hysteria, but I know better. There's a whole hidden world out there, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and campfires. A world where impossible creatures roam, and ancient mysteries still lurk in the shadows. Most of the time, that world stays hidden, separate from our mundane reality. But sometimes, when we venture too far into the wild places, when we forget that we're guests in a realm we don't fully understand, the barrier between worlds grows thin. And if we're not careful, if we don't respect the old ways and the old rules, we might find ourselves face to face with something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. So if you're ever deep in the forest, far from the well-worn trails and comfortable campgrounds, and you hear a knock in the night, be afraid, be very afraid, because it might just be answering your call, drawing you deeper into a mystery as old as the forests themselves. And once you've crossed that threshold, there's no going back to the safe, familiar world you once knew. Story 7. Snowstorms are supposed to be peaceful, blanketing everything in a calm, quiet stillness. But out here, isolated in a remote cabin, the blizzard felt more like a prison. The wind howled against the wooden walls, and the snow piled up so high it covered half the windows. The radio had gone dead hours ago. and with it, our only connection to the outside world. We were alone, cut off, and that's when the whispers began. I was on patrol with Jeff, my partner for the week. We were both park rangers, assigned to this part of the forest to monitor the wildlife and keep an eye on any hikers who might have been caught off guard by the sudden turn in the weather. It was supposed to be a routine stint in one of the park's more secluded cabins, but the storm hit faster and harder than we anticipated. We'd spent most of the day reinforcing the cabin, making sure the roof wouldn't collapse under the weight of the snow, and that the windows were sealed tight against the bitter wind. By nightfall, the blizzard had turned into a full-on whiteout. Visibility was zero. The cabin creaked with every gust, and we could hear the trees outside groaning under the strain of the ice and wind. The first sign that something was wrong came around midnight. Jeff and I were sitting near the fireplace, bundled up in blankets, sipping coffee to keep warm. The cabin was small, just one main room with a bunk bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and the fireplace. The only light came from the flickering flames and our dim, battery-operated lantern. Out of nowhere, a sound cut through the wind, a faint, muffled cry. I lowered my mug and glanced at Jeff. He was staring at the door, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows deepening with every crackle of the fire. Jeff nodded slowly. "Yeah, it sounded like a voice." We both sat there, straining our ears, waiting. For a few moments, all I could hear was the wind rattling the shutters and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. Then, there it was again, a weak, desperate cry for help carried on the wind. "Is someone out there?" I muttered, standing up and walking toward the window. I wiped away the layer of frost that had formed on the glass and peered into the darkness. Snow was whipping across the ground in a swirling, chaotic dance, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. "Impossible," Jeff said, getting to his feet. "Nobody could survive out there in this storm." But the cries continued, growing louder, more frantic. It was definitely a voice, calling for help, pleading to be let in. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and concern. If there really was someone out there, they wouldn't last long in these conditions. "Maybe it's a hiker who got lost," I suggested, though even as I said it, doubt gnawed at my mind. The trails had been closed for days. No one should have been out here. Jeff grabbed the flashlight off the table, his jaw set. "We can't just ignore it. Let's take a quick look, but we stick together, got it?" I nodded, reluctantly pulling on my jacket and gloves. The moment we opened the door, the cold hit us like a sledgehammer, stealing the breath from my lungs. The snow was blinding, whipping into my face and stinging my eyes. Jeff shone the flashlight out into the darkness, the beam barely piercing through the swirling storm. "Hello," Jeff called out, his voice immediately swallowed by the howling wind. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. I scanned the area, squinting against the snow, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing but the shifting shadows of snowdrifts and the gnarled shapes of trees bending in the gale. "Help, please." The voice came again, closer this time, so close I almost jumped. I turned toward the sound, my pulse racing. It was coming from the tree line, just beyond the edge of our lantern's glow. Jeff took a cautious step forward. "Hey, if you're out there, keep talking so we can find you." But what happened next sent a chill down my spine. The voice changed. The weak, human plea shifted into something else, something darker. The words became garbled, twisted, like a recording being played backward. Then it started to laugh, a low, wet chuckle that rose into a piercing screech. "Back inside, now!" I shouted, grabbing Jeff's arm and yanking him toward the cabin. We stumbled back through the door, slamming it shut behind us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, bolting the door and leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The cabin felt like it was closing in around us, the darkness in the corners deepening, swallowing the light from the fire. Jeff was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the door. "That wasn't human," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. We stood there in silence, listening. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but the laughter was gone. The only sounds now were the creaks and groans of the cabin as the storm raged on. Then a soft, scraping noise started. It was coming from the window, a light, scratching sound that made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, my stomach knotting with fear, and looked at the frost-covered glass. A shadow passed by, barely visible through the snow and darkness. I held my breath, waiting, my muscles tensed. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across the wooden walls. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Jeff grabbed the lantern and inched toward the window, his face a mask of dread. "Don't!" I hissed. But he ignored me, raising the light to get a better look. What we saw made my blood run cold. A face was pressed against the glass, gaunt and skeletal, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, grey and mottled, and its mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. It stared at us, unblinking, the frost around its breath marking it as something alive, though it seemed anything but. Then it moved. Its lips parted, and it spoke in a voice that was both too high and too deep, a grotesque mimicry of the human cries we had heard earlier. "Help! Let me in!" I staggered back, my mind reeling. The thing outside wasn't human, it was something else, something ancient and monstrous. The stories, the legends, flooded into my memory, tales of the Wendigo, a creature that prowled the forests during the harsh winters, feeding on the lost and the desperate. Jeff dropped the lantern, the glass shattering as it hit the floor. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the dim light of the fire. We backed away from the window, moving toward the center of the cabin, as if distance could protect us. The creature outside began to move again, circling the cabin, its footsteps crunching through the snow. It scratched at the walls, the door, the windows, testing for any weakness. The sound was maddening, relentless, like claws raking over stone. "We have to stay inside," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's trying to lure us out." Jeff nodded, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "But how long can we last? The storm isn't letting up, and we're trapped in here with that." The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the howling wind. Then a heavy thump sounded from the roof, followed by a series of slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart raced. It was on the cabin now, moving above us. The creaking of the wooden beams echoed through the room, and I felt a crushing weight in my chest. The thing outside was playing with us, toying with our fear. We huddled together, our eyes locked on the ceiling as the footsteps moved back and forth. It stopped directly above the fireplace, and I could hear it breathing, a slow, raspy wheeze that made my skin crawl. It stayed there, just out of sight, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. The fire began to die down, and the cold seeped into the cabin, turning our breath into misty puffs. We didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, our eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the next sign of movement. And then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. The creature climbed down from the roof, its weight thudding against the walls as it descended. We listened as it moved away from the cabin, the sound of its steps fading into the storm. Silence returned. We sat there, too terrified to speak, too scared to hope that it was really gone. The cabin creaked, the wind howled, but the scratching and the laughter were no more. Hours passed before we dared to move. When daylight finally filtered through the windows, revealing a world buried in snow, we cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. There, in the snow around the cabin, were deep, clawed footprints. They circled the cabin again and again, leading away into the forest where they vanished among the trees. We never spoke about what happened that night. When the storm cleared, we radioed for help and left the forest behind. But every winter, When the wind howls and the snow piles up high, I remember those whispers, that face pressed against the glass. And I know that some things in the wilderness are better left undisturbed. Some cries for help aren't meant to be answered. Story 8. The sound of my radio, crackling to life, shattered the eerie silence of the forest. Static, just static. That's when I knew I was truly alone out here, cut off from the world, with something watching me from the shadows. Something that shouldn't exist. My name's Jake, and I've been a forest ranger at Glacier National Park for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Bear attacks, lost hikers, even the occasional poacher, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night at Elk Creek Cabin. It started as a routine call. The cabin, a remote outpost used by backcountry hikers, had reportedly been vandalized. Normally, we'd wait until morning to check it out, but with the recent uptick in bear activity, my supervisor wanted it handled immediately. So there I was, driving down a bumpy fire road as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a rustic log structure that had stood for nearly a century. As I pulled up, everything looked normal. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But as soon as I stepped out of my truck, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The door creaked open at my touch, unlocked. I swept my flashlight across the interior, taking in the sparse furnishings, a couple of bunks, a wood stove, a small table. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Then my light caught something on the far wall. Claw marks. Deep gouges in the solid log wall, splintering the wood. These weren't your typical bear scratches. They were huge, easily 8 feet off the ground, and there was a pattern to them that seemed almost deliberate. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray on my belt as I moved closer to inspect the marks. That's when I noticed something else. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught in the splintered wood. I reached out to touch it, and a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't bear fur. It was too long, too coarse, almost like... A loud snap outside made me whirl around, my heart pounding. Through the cabin's single window, I could see nothing but darkness. I fumbled for my radio, needing to report this, to have some connection to the outside world. Dispatch, this is Ranger Collins, at Elk Creek Cabin. I've got some strange damage here, possible wildlife involvement, requesting backup to... The radio crackled and went dead. I tried again, but there was nothing, just static. Another snap outside, closer this time, and then a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. This was something else entirely. I moved to the window, straining to see into the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then my flashlight beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the tree line. They were huge, too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and they were fixed directly on me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be suicide. Whatever was out there, it was between me and my truck. The cabin, as flimsy as it seemed, was my only protection. I doused my flashlight and retreated to the far corner of the cabin, trying to control my breathing. Outside, I could hear movement. Heavy footsteps, the crunch of leaves and twigs. It was circling the cabin. The minutes stretched into hours. Every so often, I'd hear that growl again, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. But those eyes, those glowing eyes, they never left. I could feel them watching, waiting. As the night wore on, my mind raced with possibilities. A grizzly bear on its hind legs. No, the claw marks were all wrong, and bears don't stalk like this. A mountain lion, too big. My thoughts drifted to old legends I'd heard from some of the local tribes, stories of huge, hair-covered creatures that roamed the mountains, creatures that were neither man nor beast. I'd always dismissed those tales as campfire stories, but now, trapped in this cabin with something impossible lurking outside, I wasn't so sure. Around 3 a.m., things escalated. A heavy thud against the cabin wall made me jump, then another. It was testing the structure, looking for a way in. I gripped my bear spray tighter, knowing it would probably be useless against whatever this was, but it was all I had. The assault on the cabin continued for what felt like hours. Thudding impacts interspersed with that bone-chilling growl. I was certain that at any moment the logs would give way, and I'd be face to face with what? Just as I thought the walls would cave in, it stopped. The forest fell silent again. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement outside. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way to the window. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. Its body was covered in long, matted fur, dark as the shadows it was melting back into. For a brief moment, it turned and our eyes met. I saw intelligence there, something ancient and wild. Then it was gone, vanishing into the forest as if it had never been. As soon as the sun cleared the mountains, I made a break for my truck. I drove back to headquarters in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. I reported everything, of course. The claw marks, the hair, the damage to the cabin. I told them about the creature I'd seen. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They sent out a team to investigate, but by the time they arrived, any tracks had been washed away by a sudden mountain storm. Convenient that the official report cited unusual bear activity. The claw marks were dismissed as the work of an exceptionally large grizzly. The hair samples, well, they were mysteriously lost before they could be properly analyzed. But I know what I saw. In the weeks and months that followed, I threw myself into research. I dug up old newspapers, interviewed local elders, pored over centuries of reported sightings. A pattern emerged. Stories of large, ape-like creatures in the mountains. Encounters that defied explanation. The details varied, but the core remained the same. Something was out there, something that didn't fit into our neat categories of known animals. I've never seen the creature again, at least not clearly, but sometimes, on late-night patrols in the deep backcountry, I'll catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my flashlight beam, a shadow that seems too large, too bipedal to be a normal animal. Once, I even heard that distinctive growl again, echoing across a moonlit valley. I've changed since that night at Elk Creek Cabin. The forest that once felt like home now holds an air of mystery, of hidden depths I'm only beginning to understand. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, peering into the shadows between the trees. Most of my colleagues think I'm paranoid, maybe even a little crazy, but a few have had their own unexplainable encounters. We don't talk about it openly, but there's an understanding between us. A shared knowledge that the wilderness holds secrets, things that defy our modern, rational worldview. I still love these mountains, still feel called to protect them and the life they contain. But now I approach my job with a newfound respect for the unknown. I've learned that there are things in this world that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight. So if you ever find yourself deep in the backcountry, in those quiet hours when the world holds its breath, and you feel eyes watching you from the darkness, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because maybe, just maybe, you're getting a glimpse of something wonderful and terrifying, a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist, but does. And if you hear a growl in the night that raises the hairs on the back of your neck and speaks to some primal part of your brain, run, and don't look back. Because not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and some truths are better left hidden in the wild places of the world. Story 9. Driving down a lonely backwoods road at night has a way of making your mind play tricks on you. Every shadow seems to slither just out of view, and every rustle of leaves feels like eyes watching you from the dark. I told myself it was just my imagination as I wound my car through the dense forest, the trees on either side towering like silent sentinels. But deep down, a gnawing feeling in my gut warned me that something was out there, lurking just beyond the headlights' reach. It had been a long day of visiting some old friends out in the country, and the drive home was supposed to be uneventful. Just an hour or two along this backwoods road, and then I'd hit the main highway. No big deal, I thought. I'd driven this route a few times before, but this night felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The clock on my dash read 11:27 p.m., and the road ahead stretched into darkness. My headlights carved out a narrow path of visibility, revealing nothing but winding asphalt and the occasional glint of eyes from a deer or some other nocturnal animal in the underbrush. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the faint static of the radio I'd turned off an hour ago. I was utterly alone out here, surrounded by miles of wilderness. I'd driven for about 20 minutes when I felt it. A shudder ran through the car, a sudden jarring impact that sent my heart into my throat. Something heavy had hit the side of my vehicle. I gripped the wheel, forcing the car to stay steady as I slowed down, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I threw the car into park. The forest around me was still, the only movement coming from the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. I took a deep breath and turned on my hazard lights, the orange flashes casting eerie shadows across the road. I had to see what hit my car. Maybe it was a deer or some animal that had darted out and glanced off the side. But a part of me, the part that was cold with fear, knew it was something else. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I shone the flashlight along the side of my car, and my heart skipped a beat. Deep, jagged claw marks ran from the back door to the rear fender, gouging through the metal as though it was made of paper. "What the?" I muttered, my voice trembling. No animal could have made those marks. The slashes were too high, too deep, and too deliberate. I shone the light into the darkness, sweeping it across the trees and the dense undergrowth lining the road. Nothing, just an endless sea of black, broken only by the occasional glint of dew on the leaves. I listened, my ears straining to catch any sound over the pounding of my heart. For a moment, all was still. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, echoing from the darkness to my right. My blood turned to ice as I swung the flashlight in that direction, the beam shaking in my unsteady hand. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air like a warning. Something was out there, something big. I squinted into the shadows, and that's when I saw it. Two eyes, glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting back with an eerie yellowish hue. They were too high off the ground, set wide apart, and fixed directly on me. My heart skipped a beat as the creature stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch its outline. It stood on two legs, hunched slightly, its shoulders broad and muscular, covered in a layer of thick, matted fur. Its head was unmistakably canine, elongated like that of a wolf, but its eyes held an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. I was staring at something out of a nightmare, a werewolf or a dogman. I didn't know which, but it was real, and it was watching me with a predator's focus. My throat went dry. I wanted to scream, to run back into the car and drive the hell out of there, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The creature tilted its head, sniffing the air as if savoring my scent. Its lips curled back, revealing a row of sharp, glistening teeth, and it took a step forward, moving with a strange, fluid grace that sent a jolt of terror through me. That was enough to break my paralysis. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as I turned and lunged for the car door. I could hear it moving behind me, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, closing the distance far faster than I could manage in my panic. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, just as something slammed against the side of the car, with a force that rocked the entire vehicle. My hand shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw it, standing just behind the car, one hand resting on the trunk, its eyes locked onto mine. It was huge, its form silhouetted against the dark backdrop of the forest. My blood ran cold as it snarled, the sound reverberating through the car. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the pavement as the car shot forward. The creature let out a deafening roar that echoed through the trees, a sound of pure, unbridled rage. My heart pounded against my ribs as I gripped the wheel, the car swerving slightly on the narrow road as I sped away. But the nightmare wasn't over. I could hear it running, its heavy footfalls pounding against the asphalt, gaining on me. I glanced in the side mirror and my stomach dropped. It was chasing me, its long limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. The road stretched out ahead, a twisting path through the darkness, and I prayed that I could outrun it. The car's engine whined as I pushed it to its limits, the speedometer needle creeping higher. The headlights illuminated the road, trees whipping past in a blur. My pulse thundered in my ears, every nerve screaming at me to go faster, to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I risked another glance in the rearview mirror. The creature was still there, but it was falling behind, its form growing smaller in the darkness. Relief washed over me in a cold wave. I was losing it, but just as I thought I might escape, there was a thud, a sharp, metallic impact from the roof of the car. My blood turned to ice. It had jumped onto the roof. Panic surged through me as I gripped the wheel, trying to keep the car steady. The roof groaned under the weight of the creature, the metal buckling inward slightly. I could hear its claws scraping across the surface, searching for a way inside. My mind raced, desperate for a solution. I had to get it off. I had to do something. Ahead, the road curved sharply to the left, skirting the edge of a steep embankment. An idea formed in the back of my mind, risky and reckless, but it was all I had. I gritted my teeth and veered toward the edge, then yanked the wheel hard to the left. The car swerved violently, skidding on the asphalt as I took the turn too fast. I felt the back end lift slightly, the tires barely maintaining their grip. The creature on the roof lost its balance, sliding off with a heavy thud as it hit the ground and rolled into the ditch. I straightened the wheel, the car jerking back onto the road, and floored the gas pedal. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sped down the winding road, the forest closing in around me like a tunnel. Minutes felt like hours as I drove, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I kept expecting to see those glowing eyes in the mirrors, to hear the thud of claws against the car, but there was nothing, just the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I saw the lights of the highway up ahead. A sob of relief escaped my lips as I burst out of the forest and onto the main road, the bright lights of passing cars surrounding me like a lifeline. I drove for miles before I dared to pull over at a gas station. My hands were still shaking as I got out and inspected the car. Deep gouges marred the side and roof, a stark reminder that it had really happened. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that night. I know that something is out there in those woods, something that hunts and stalks the lonely roads. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to pass through its territory. Story 10. The wind howled like a ravenous beast, drowning out our screams as we stumbled through the blinding snow. We were lost, freezing, and something was hunting us. Something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. As we huddled in that cursed cave, I realized with growing horror that the real monster wasn't the storm. It was waiting for us in the darkness. My name is Sarah. And what was supposed to be a weekend hiking trip in the Rockies turned into a fight for survival against forces I still can't fully comprehend. It all started innocently enough. My best friend Mike and I had been planning this trip for months, eager to challenge ourselves on some of Colorado's more difficult trails. We set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, the air tingling with the promise of adventure. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but nothing severe. We were experienced hikers, confident in our abilities and our gear. That confidence would soon be shattered. The first few hours were exhilarating. We climbed steadily, taking in the breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks and vast forests. But as we neared the summit of our planned route, the weather began to turn. What started as a light flurry quickly escalated into a full-blown blizzard. "We need to turn back," Mike shouted over the howling wind. I nodded, already shivering despite my layers. We began our descent, but in the whiteout conditions, everything looked the same. The trail markers were buried under snow, and our GPS was struggling to get a signal. As the temperature plummeted and visibility dropped to near zero, panic began to set in. We were lost, disoriented, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. That's when Mike spotted it, a dark opening in the side of the mountain, a cave. "We need to take shelter," he yelled, pointing. I hesitated. Something about the cave felt wrong. But with the wind cutting through our clothes like icy knives, we had no choice. We stumbled into the cave, grateful to be out of the storm. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam illuminated rough stone walls that stretched back farther than I could see. The air was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the frigid world outside. "Let's not go too deep," I said, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "We don't want to get lost in here, too." Mike nodded, already unpacking his emergency blanket. We set up a small camp just inside the entrance. The howling wind, a constant reminder of the peril we'd escaped. As we huddled together for warmth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Do you hear that?" Mike whispered suddenly. Sitting up straight, I held my breath, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was the storm. Then I caught it. A faint scratching sound coming from deeper in the cave. It could have been loose rock settling or water dripping, but it sounded deliberate, probably just an animal seeking shelter like us, I said, trying to convince myself as much as Mike. But we both knew the local wildlife. What kind of animal would live this deep in a cave, this high up the mountain? The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely getting closer. Mike and I exchanged panicked looks. Should we run back into the storm, stay and face whatever was approaching? Before we could decide, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor were bones of all sizes, some obviously animal, others disturbingly human-like, and they were covered in deep grooves, claw marks. "We need to leave," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. "Again now." We scrambled to pack up our meager camp, hands shaking. The scratching had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of heavy breathing, punctuated by low, rumbling growls. That's when we saw it, my flashlight beam, swinging wildly as I moved. Illuminated a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness. They were huge, set in a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The creature was massive, its body covered in thick, matted fur. It crouched at the edge of the light, watching us with an intelligence that was terrifyingly clear. For a moment, nobody moved. We stared at the creature, and it stared back, assessing us. Then it let out a roar that shook dust from the cave walls, and charged. We ran, out of the cave and back into the howling storm. The blizzard that had seemed so threatening before was now our only hope for escape. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footfalls and ragged breathing far too close. We plunged through snowdrifts, slipping and sliding down the mountainside. My lungs burned, every breath painful in the frigid air, but fear kept us moving, the knowledge that slowing down meant certain death. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that white void, punctuated only by the sounds of our labored breathing and the creature's relentless pursuit. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw a light in the distance. A building. With a final burst of energy, we sprinted towards it. It was a ranger station, closed for the season, but still standing strong against the storm. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us and piling everything we could find against it. For hours, we huddled in that small cabin, jumping at every sound. Sometimes, We'd hear that bone-chilling roar in the distance. Once, something heavy slammed against the door, making the whole building shake, but the sturdy walls held, and eventually the noises stopped. When dawn broke and the storm finally passed, we were rescued by a search and rescue team. They'd been looking for us since we failed to return the previous evening. We told them about getting lost in the storm, about finding the cave, but we didn't mention the creature. Who would believe us? The official report cited hypothermia and snow blindness as the cause of our hallucinations. They found the cave, but there was no sign of bones, no claw marks, just an ordinary mountain cave. But I know what we saw. In the weeks and months that followed, I researched obsessively. I found old legends of the Rockies, stories of creatures that roamed the high peaks, wendigos, skinwalkers, things that defied easy classification. Most dismissed these as campfire tales or the delusions of altitude sickness. I knew better. I haven't gone back to those mountains. The memory of that night still haunts my dreams, the glowing eyes in the darkness, the sound of claws on stone. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I wonder. I wonder about what's really out there, hiding in the wild places of the world. I wonder about the thin line between the world we think we know and the darker, older world that lurks just out of sight. And I know that the next time I see a cave mouth yawning in the side of a mountain, I won't see shelter. I'll see a gateway to something ancient and terrifying, a reminder that there are some mysteries better left unsolved, some darknesses better left unexplored, because sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in our imagination. They're the ones waiting in the shadows, watching with ancient, hungry eyes. And once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never unsee them again. You can never go back to a world where they don't exist. So if you find yourself lost in the mountains, cold and seeking shelter, think twice before you enter that inviting cave, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness, and some things, once awakened, can never be put back to sleep. Story 11. The forest has a way of knowing when you don't belong. I felt it the moment I set foot on the trail that morning, a subtle shift, an unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. The woods were quiet, unnaturally so, like everything was holding its breath, waiting. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of me. That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. I'd been itching to explore this part of the national forest for months. It was remote, off the beaten path, where the trees grow thick and ancient, untouched by the usual crowds of weekend hikers. It was just me and my dog, Rocky, a German shepherd who was as fearless as they come. He usually led the way, tail wagging, eager to sniff out every inch of our surroundings. But today something was different. Rocky walked close to my side, his ears perked up, every muscle tense. He would stop every few steps, sniff the air, and let out a low, uneasy whine. I tried to brush it off, patting his head and mumbling words of encouragement. It's just the wilderness, bud. Nothing we haven't seen before. But my words felt hollow, even to me. The deeper we ventured, the more I began to notice the signs. Small things at first, strange stick formations on the ground, almost like makeshift barriers or symbols. Large branches bent and snapped at odd angles, creating unnatural arches over the trail. I paused to examine one of them, a branch that had been twisted until it split. No animal could have done that. It was as if the forest itself had bent to someone's or something's will. Rocky whined again, this time more urgently, and I looked up to see him staring off into the trees. His hackles were raised, his body rigid. My stomach tightened. He only ever acted this way when there was a real threat nearby. My eyes followed his gaze, scanning the underbrush and the shadows between the trees. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless expanse of trunks and leaves. Then, I noticed them. Massive footprints pressed deep into the forest floor, leading off the trail. They were spaced too far apart for a human and far too large. I crouched down, placing my hand inside one of the prints. It dwarfed my palm, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. The tracks were fresh. "Come on, Rocky," I whispered, rising to my feet. "Let's keep moving." But a voice inside my head was screaming to turn back, to leave this place. I ignored it, pushing forward, curiosity and fear driving me in equal measure. We continued along the trail, winding deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the light dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. The silence became oppressive, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. Rocky stayed close, his ears twitching at every creak and rustle. After about an hour, we reached a small clearing. I let out a sigh of relief, grateful for the open space and the sliver of sky visible through the treetops. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree, its bark twisted and scarred. I approached it cautiously, the air around it feeling heavy, almost electric. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural howl echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees and sending a jolt of fear through my body. It was deep, resonant, unlike any animal sound I had ever heard. Rocky bristled, his lips curling into a silent snarl as he pressed against my leg. My heart hammered in my chest. We were not alone. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I spun around, my eyes darting across the tree line. There, half hidden in the shadows, I saw it. A massive, hulking figure stood just at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was covered in thick, dark hair that matted against its muscular frame. Its arms were long, its shoulders broad, and its head seemed to rest directly on its torso, with no discernible neck. My breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with it. They were deep, dark, and gleamed with an intelligence that terrified me. Sasquatch. The word forced itself into my mind, bringing with it every story and legend I'd ever heard. But none of those tales had prepared me for the reality of standing face to face with this creature. It exuded an aura of power, of ancient, primal strength that made me feel like an intruder in its domain. Rocky growled low in his throat, his stance defensive, ready to protect me. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching us, swaying slightly as if considering what to do next. I raised my hand slowly, trying to signal that I meant no harm. My mouth was dry, my voice barely a whisper when I spoke. "It's okay. We're just passing through." The creature blinked, its eyes narrowing. Then it took a step forward, its movement fluid and unsettlingly silent for something so large. My legs turned to jelly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in its gaze, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. The creature let out a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air, through the ground beneath my feet. Rocky barked, a sharp, warning sound, but he didn't charge. He seemed to understand that whatever we were dealing with was far beyond his ability to confront, and then the creature stopped. It lifted one massive hand, pointing toward the way we had come. It didn't roar or advance. It just stood there, pointing. The message was clear: leave, now. My heart pounded, and I nodded, swallowing hard. Okay, we're going," I stammered, my voice shaking. I reached down, grabbing Rocky's collar, and started to back away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature. We moved toward the trail, step by trembling step, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The creature watched us the entire time, its hand still outstretched, as if drawing a line in the forest that we were forbidden to cross. I kept my pace steady, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. When we reached the edge of the clearing, I turned and glanced back one last time. The creature had lowered its arm and was now standing completely still, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the forest. It made no move to follow as we slipped back into the dense cover of the trees. The walk back was a blur, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. Rocky stayed close to my side, his head low, his movements cautious. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature following us, but the forest behind us remained empty. It wasn't until we were almost out of the woods, back near the start of the trail, that I dared to slow down. My legs were shaking, and I had to brace myself against a tree to keep from collapsing. Rocky sat at my feet, his eyes fixed on the path behind us. He let out a low whine, his gaze never wavering from the darkness of the forest. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. We were safe for now. I had no idea what we had encountered, but one thing was clear. It had let us go. It could have charged, could have attacked, but it hadn't. It had simply warned us. I looked down at Rocky and scratched behind his ears, grateful for his presence. "We're not coming back here, boy," I muttered, my voice hoarse. "Not ever." As we made our way to the car, the forest remained silent. The uneasy feeling that had plagued me all day began to lift, replaced by a profound sense of respect and fear. We had ventured into a place that didn't belong to us, a place that had a guardian far older and far more powerful than any of the stories I'd heard. I've never returned to that part of the forest, and I never will. Sometimes, late at night, I'll dream of that clearing, of those dark eyes watching me with an ancient, unyielding judgment. And I know that some places are meant to be left alone, guarded by creatures that walk the line between legend and reality. Out there, deep in the wilderness, there are territories that belong to things far beyond our understanding. And if you ever stumble into one, you'd better listen when they tell you to leave. Story 12. The crunch of gravel under my tires came to an abrupt halt as my car sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on a desolate mountain road. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ominous whisper of wind through the pines. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I realized, with growing horror, that I wasn't alone on this lonely stretch of road. Something was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. My name is Eleanor, and I never believed in monsters until that night on Wolf Creek Pass. I'm a practical person, a high school science teacher who deals in facts and evidence. But what I encountered in those mountains defied all rational explanation and shattered my understanding of the world. It was supposed to be a simple drive. I was heading back home after visiting my sister in Denver, taking the scenic route through the San Juan Mountains. The sunset had painted the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple, and I couldn't resist pulling over at a viewpoint to snap a few photos. That delay proved to be a critical mistake. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, and I found myself navigating winding roads with only my headlights to guide me. The radio faded to static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the humming of my engine, until that engine decided to give up the ghost. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, my heart sinking. I was miles from the nearest town, in a dead zone with no cell service. As I popped the hood and peered inside, I realized I was way out of my depth. Whatever was wrong with the car, it wasn't something I could fix with my limited knowledge of auto mechanics. That's when I heard the first growl. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, or maybe the settling of my cooling engine. But then I heard it again, louder this time, and unmistakably animalistic. My hand instinctively went to the small canister of bear spray attached to my keychain, a gift from my sister who worried about my solo road trips. I shone my flashlight into the woods lining the road, half expecting to see the reflective eyes of a mountain lion or wolf. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. There, just at the edge of the trees, stood a figure that had no right existing outside of a horror movie. It was tall, far taller than any man I'd ever seen, its massive frame covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the way it stood, upright on two legs in a pose that was unnervingly human. And its face, God, its face, a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with the elongated snout full of gleaming teeth and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with an unnatural, yellowish glow. For a moment, we both stood frozen, me paralyzed with fear, and the creature assessing its prey. Then it took a step forward, and the spell broke. I scrambled back into my car, slamming and locking the doors. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip my keys, but somehow I managed to jam them into the ignition. I turned them once, twice, praying to whatever might be listening for the engine to start. Nothing, just the hollow click of a dead battery. A heavy thud on the roof of the car made me scream. Claws, actual claws, punctured the metal as if it were tinfoil, and the entire vehicle rocked as the creature tried to tear its way inside. I ducked down in my seat, my mind racing. The bear spray. It was my only chance. With trembling fingers, I uncapped the spray, ready to use it the moment the creature broke through. The assault on my car continued, each impact threatening to shatter the windows or tear the doors from their hinges. The creature let out a howl that was part wolf, part human scream, a sound that spoke to some primal part of my brain and told me to run, to hide, to do anything to survive. In desperation, I laid on the horn. The sudden blare seemed to startle the creature. It paused its attack, and in that moment of hesitation, I saw my chance. I threw open the door and sprayed the bear spray directly into its face. The creature reeled back, roaring in pain and anger. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran like I'd never run before, my legs pumping furiously as I tore down the mountain road. Behind me, I could hear the creature's enraged howls, spurred on by the pain and the thrill of the chase. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the blind panic of flight. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but the sound of pursuit kept me going. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station! I burst into the fluorescent-lit shop, gasping for breath and barely able to form coherent words. The startled attendant took one look at my wild eyes and torn clothes and reached for the phone to call for help. As we waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that monstrous face peering in, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark road and the silent forest beyond. The official report blamed my experience on exhaustion and the tricks of light and shadow in the mountains at night. They found my car, the roof dented and scratched, but attributed the damage to a bear attack. No one believed my story about a wolf-like creature walking on two legs. In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I scoured old newspapers, interviewed locals, and dug into the folklore of the region. What I found both terrified and fascinated me. Stories of skinwalkers from Native American legends, tales of werewolves brought over by European settlers, sightings of creatures that defied easy categorization, dating back centuries. Most people dismiss these accounts as campfire stories or the delusions of isolated mountain folk, but I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt the raw terror of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I never drove that mountain pass again, but the experience changed me profoundly. I look at the world differently now, always aware that there might be more lurking in the shadows than we're willing to admit. I find myself drawn to the edges of maps, to the wild places where civilization gives way to untamed wilderness. Not because I want to encounter that creature again, God, no, but because I now understand that there are mysteries in this world that science can't yet explain. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I think I hear a distant, familiar growl. In those moments, I'm transported back to that lonely mountain road, face to face with something ancient and terrifying, and I wonder how many others have encountered these creatures, how many stories have been dismissed, buried, forgotten. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it, but I know what I saw that night. I know that somewhere out there, in the deep forests and on the lonely mountain roads, there are things that defy our understanding of the world, things that watch and wait, reminding us that we are not always at the top of the food chain. So the next time you find yourself on a dark, lonely road, and you hear something moving in the woods beside you, something too big to be a normal animal, something that walks on 2 legs instead of 4, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because maybe, just maybe, you're getting a glimpse of a world beyond our own, a world where legends come to life and monsters are real. And if you see a pair of glowing eyes watching you from the darkness, reflecting your headlights with an unnatural gleam, don't stop. Don't get out of your car. Drive, and don't look back, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are better left in the shadows where they belong. Story 13. The first time I heard the scratching, I thought it was just the wind. It was our second night in the cabin, and the woods around us had grown unnervingly quiet. My girlfriend, Liz, was already asleep, curled up under the blankets next to me. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustling outside. Then came the noise, low and deliberate, like claws dragging across wood. We had rented the cabin for a weekend escape, a chance to get away from the city and unwind in nature. It was tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, and promised a quiet, disconnected experience. During the day, it was perfect. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds sang, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. But now, with night settling in and the wind picking up, the isolation felt less like a luxury and more like a trap. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. There it was again. Scratch, scratch, coming from the front porch. It was too rhythmic to be the wind, too deliberate. My stomach twisted into a knot as I glanced over at the window. The curtains were drawn, but the sense of something lurking on the other side made my skin prickle. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, nudging Liz. She stirred and groaned, burying her face deeper into the pillow. "Hear what?" she mumbled sleepily. "Scratching." "On the porch?" she sighed, turning over to face me, her eyes half open. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," she muttered, already drifting back to sleep. I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right. After all, we were in the woods. It was normal for animals to wander around at night. I lay back down, listening as the scratching continued, then stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept my eyes on the shadows in the room, every creak of the cabin making my heart skip a beat. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn peeked through the curtains, I finally let out a sigh of relief. I shook off the lingering fear, telling myself it was all in my head. The next day, we went about our plans as usual. We hiked through the forest, took pictures, and even managed to spot a deer grazing in a clearing. I didn't mention the scratching to Liz again. She seemed relaxed, and I didn't want to spoil the trip. Besides, I had almost convinced myself it was just some curious animal. Almost. That evening, after dinner, we sat on the porch with mugs of hot chocolate, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The forest around us was peaceful, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. But as darkness settled in, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped sharply, and a thick, unsettling stillness crept into the air. "Let's head inside," I suggested, suddenly feeling exposed, sitting out in the open. Liz nodded, wrapping her sweater tighter around herself, and we went back into the cabin, locking the door behind us. Night came quickly. We put on a movie, but I found it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting to the previous night, to the scratching. I glanced at the windows now and then, expecting to see something, but the curtains revealed nothing but darkness beyond. We decided to call it a night around 11. I wasn't tired, but I hoped that being in bed would at least calm my nerves. I crawled under the covers, listening to the faint sound of the wind against the cabin walls. Liz fell asleep almost immediately, her soft breathing filling the room. And then it came again. Scratch, scratch, louder this time, and unmistakably close. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from the front door now, a slow, scraping noise that made my skin crawl. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a cold sweat broke out along my spine. "Liz," I whispered urgently, shaking her awake. "Listen." She groggily lifted her head, blinking in the darkness. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the wooden walls. Liz's eyes widened, and I saw fear flicker across her face. "What the hell is that?" she breathed, sitting up and clutching the blanket to her chest. "I don't know," I whispered back, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. "But it's right outside." We sat there, frozen in silence, listening as the scratching moved from the front door to the side of the cabin. It dragged along the wall, inching closer to the bedroom window. I felt a surge of panic rise in my throat. My mind raced, picturing all sorts of animals that could be out there, but none of them fit. This felt wrong. The scratching stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was suffocating, an unbearable tension that pressed in on us from all sides. I strained my ears, listening for any hint of movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, ever so slowly, the doorknob to the front door began to turn. My blood ran cold. I bolted out of bed, motioning for Liz to stay put. I crept toward the living room, every step careful and quiet. My eyes locked on the door. The knob jiggled, as if something on the other side was testing it, trying to figure out how to get in. I reached the kitchen counter and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, clutching it tightly in my hand. My palms were slick with sweat, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear. I watched in horror as the knob slowly stopped turning, followed by a light thud against the door, as though whatever was outside had pressed itself against the wood, listening. I didn't dare to breathe. The thudding stopped, and then I heard the faintest of noises, a low, deep growl, so close it seemed to reverberate through the walls. I tightened my grip on the knife, ready to defend myself if the door gave way. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally the growl faded, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps shuffling away from the door. I waited, counting each step, until they disappeared into the distance. Only then did I dare to move, creeping back to the bedroom. Liz was sitting up, her face pale and eyes wide. "Is it gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. I think so," I managed to say, though I didn't believe it. Whatever was out there had left on its own terms. It wasn't scared of us. It was simply done, for now. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We huddled together on the bed, the knife clutched in my hand, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, we cautiously ventured outside. The porch was covered in deep scratches, long and jagged, gouged into the wood. They ran along the doorframe and continued down the side of the cabin, trailing off into the forest. But the most chilling part was the footprints. They were large, humanoid, but with long claws embedded in the prints. My heart skipped a beat as I followed them with my eyes, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the underbrush. "We need to leave," Liz whispered, clutching my arm. "Now!" I didn't argue. We packed up our things in a frenzy, constantly glancing over our shoulders, expecting to see something or someone emerging from the trees. The entire forest felt like it was watching us, a silent, looming presence that pressed in from all sides. We loaded the car and drove away, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing with the memory of that scratching, that growl. I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some animal, though I doubt it. Whatever it was smart enough to test the door, to circle the cabin, to make its presence known in a way that wasn't a simple warning. It was a claim. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I have no intention of returning. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind scratches against my windows at home, I feel that cold knot of fear return. I'll lie awake, straining to hear anything beyond the usual creaks and groans of the house. And in those moments, I wonder if it followed us, if it's just waiting for the right time to scratch at the door again. Story 14. Campfires are supposed to be comforting. They're supposed to push back the darkness, keep the bad things away. But as I stared into the flames that night, listening to the eerie stillness of the forest around us, I felt anything but safe. The fire flickered and danced, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch toward us like clawed hands. It was like the woods were closing in, watching, waiting. We had been camping in this remote spot for 3 days, miles away from any signs of civilization. It was supposed to be a getaway, a chance for me and my 3 friends, Mark, Jess, and Olivia, to escape the chaos of city life. The first 2 nights had been fine, even fun. We spent our days hiking through the dense forest and our nights huddled around the campfire, swapping ghost stories and laughing at the absurdity of our own fears. But tonight was different. The forest felt wrong. It had grown unnervingly quiet, as if every living creature had fled, leaving us alone in the oppressive darkness. Even the crackle of the fire seemed muted, swallowed up by the void around us. I looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of my friends. They felt it too. Mark poked at the fire with a stick, his jaw clenched, while Jess kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? Olivia finally broke the silence, her voice tight with tension. Yeah, I admitted, my gaze fixed on the wall of darkness beyond the firelight. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I had felt that sensation all evening. A prickling on the back of my neck, a sense of eyes staring at us from the shadows. Probably just some animals, Mark said, trying to sound casual, but the waver in his voice betrayed him. We're in their territory, after all. But it's too quiet, Jess muttered, hugging her knees to her chest. Where are all the crickets, the frogs, even the birds are gone? She was right. The forest had gone deathly silent, and it made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to break the tension, when a sound froze me in place. Snap. It came from the trees just beyond the edge of our campsite, a sharp, deliberate snap of a branch underfoot. Every muscle in my body tensed, my heart hammered against my ribs as I turned toward the sound, peering into the darkness. The fire cast just enough light to illuminate the first few feet of the undergrowth, but beyond that, it was an inky black void. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her eyes wide. "Yeah," I replied, my mouth suddenly dry. "Something's out there." We all sat there, holding our breath, straining our ears for any other sound. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the air, but that was it. Silence. Just when I started to think I'd imagined it, the sound came again. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the edge of our campsite. "What the hell is that?" Mark hissed, standing up and gripping the stick he'd been using to poke the fire like a makeshift weapon. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. "But it's big." The footsteps continued, moving in a wide arc around us. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. It was as if something was pacing the perimeter, testing us, deciding what to do next. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was clutching my flashlight. I flicked it on, aiming the beam into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. "See anything?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "No," I muttered, but even as I said it, my stomach twisted with fear. I could feel it out there, watching us, just beyond the edge of the light. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, tall and broad, slipped between the trees so fast I almost doubted I'd seen it. I swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam caught only the empty undergrowth. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. "We need to pack up and get out of here," Olivia said, her voice shaky but firm. "Right now." I nodded, my eyes still scanning the darkness. "Yeah, let's go. Everyone grab your stuff and stay close." We scrambled to our feet, moving quickly but cautiously, throwing our gear into backpacks with fumbling hands. The fire crackled beside us, the only light keeping the darkness at bay. The whole time, I kept my flashlight trained on the perimeter, watching for any sign of movement. My heart pounded, each second stretching into an eternity. Then it happened. A roar shattered the silence. a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the air and made my blood run cold. It came from somewhere in the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of something huge crashing through the underbrush toward us. "Go!" I screamed, adrenaline surging through me as I grabbed my backpack and ran. My friends were right behind me, their panicked breaths echoing in the darkness as we bolted down the narrow trail that led away from the campsite. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and what I saw nearly made me trip and fall. In the dim glow of the dying fire, I caught a glimpse of a massive, towering figure. It was covered in thick, matted hair, its eyes reflecting the firelight with an eerie yellow glow. It moved with terrifying speed, crashing through the trees, heading straight for where we had just been. "Keep running!" I yelled, my legs burning as I pushed forward. The trail twisted and turned through the forest, the branches clawing at us as we stumbled in the dark. I could hear the creature behind us, its footsteps heavy and relentless, the roar still echoing in my ears. We ran blindly, driven by pure terror, until we burst out of the dense woods into a small clearing. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. The others collapsed beside me, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. We stood there, panting, listening to the forest around us. The footsteps had stopped. The roaring had ceased. For a moment, all we could hear was our own ragged breathing and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Did we lose it?" Jess stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know," I managed to reply, my heart still racing. I raised my flashlight, shining it toward the edge of the clearing. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching toward us in the faint moonlight. We waited, every second an agony of uncertainty. And then, just when I thought we might be safe, the forest came alive with a series of thudding footsteps. My blood turned to ice. It was circling us again, staying just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows. "What do we do?" Olivia whimpered, clutching my arm. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think. We couldn't outrun it, and we couldn't stay here. The only option was to keep moving, to make it to the trailhead where our car was parked. "We keep moving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Stick together. Stay in the clearing as much as possible. It doesn't seem to like the open space." We began walking, slowly at first, every step feeling like a gamble with whatever was stalking us. The creature followed, its presence a constant, looming threat just out of sight. We could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, occasionally letting out low, rumbling growls that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We pushed through the clearing, back onto the trail, our breaths coming in short, fearful gasps. The path ahead was faintly visible in the moonlight, winding its way through the forest. We moved as quickly as we dared, trying to stay quiet, trying not to provoke it. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and I saw a glimmer of hope. The trailhead, our car. Relief surged through me, and I glanced back. The forest was still. The footsteps had stopped. I couldn't see it anymore. We sprinted the last few yards, practically throwing ourselves into the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, finally getting them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the gravel road, leaving the darkness behind. No one spoke for a long time. We drove in silence, our minds replaying the terror of what had just happened. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that massive, shadowy figure following us. It never did. But as we left the forest behind, a part of me knew it was still out there, patrolling its territory, watching for the next group of campers to invade its domain. The fire hadn't kept it away. The clearing hadn't stopped it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only escaped because it let us go. Somewhere deep in those woods, something waits. It watches the campfires, it circles the campsites, and when it decides to make its presence known, it does so with an authority that leaves no room for doubt. That forest belongs to it, and it doesn't like trespassers. Story 15. I should have turned back when I first heard the footsteps. My name is Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for years. I've tackled some of the most challenging trails across the country, But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the Appalachian Trail that fateful evening. It was late September, and I had been on the trail for nearly 2 weeks. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, the leaves just beginning to turn their brilliant shades of red and gold. I had planned this solo hike for months, eager to challenge myself and reconnect with nature. That day had been particularly grueling. I'd pushed myself hard, covering more ground than usual in an attempt to reach a specific campsite before nightfall. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the path, I realized I might not make it before dark. The first indication that something was off came as I rounded a bend in the trail. The birds, which had been chattering incessantly all day, suddenly fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, plunging the forest into an eerie quiet. I paused, my senses on high alert, but after a moment I shrugged it off and continued on my way. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, coming from somewhere behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. Other hikers weren't uncommon on the trail, even this late in the season. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see a fellow trekker catching up to me, but the path behind me was empty. The footsteps stopped. I stood still, straining my ears. Nothing, just the whisper of wind through the trees and my own heartbeat, which had begun to quicken. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. No response. Shaking off my unease, I turned and continued walking. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon foraging for food. But then the footsteps resumed, perfectly in time with my own. When I walked, they walked. When I stopped, they stopped. It was as if whatever was behind me was mimicking my movements, staying just out of sight. I picked up my pace, my hiking boots thudding against the dirt path. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was following me was big, much bigger than a deer or raccoon. The footfalls were heavy, bipedal, and getting closer. I broke into a jog, my backpack bouncing uncomfortably as I ran. The creature behind me didn't miss a beat, its strides lengthening to keep up with me effortlessly. Panic began to set in as I realized I couldn't outrun it. The sun had nearly set now, the forest growing darker by the minute. I fumbled for my headlamp, almost dropping it in my haste to switch it on. The narrow beam of light illuminated the path ahead, but I didn't dare turn to look behind me. I could hear its breathing now, deep, ragged pants that sent chills down my spine. It was close, so close I could almost feel its presence looming over me. In my panic, I made a critical mistake. Instead of staying on the main trail, I veered off onto a smaller path, hoping to lose my pursuer. But as I crashed through the underbrush, I quickly realized my error. This wasn't a marked trail at all, but a game path, narrow and overgrown. I was off the map, in unfamiliar territory, with night falling fast and something inhuman on my heels. The thing behind me let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between that made my blood run cold. I ran blindly now, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, no longer trying to be stealthy. Suddenly the trees opened up, and I found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, the kind of forgotten structure you sometimes find deep in the woods, long abandoned by whatever early settler had built it. Without thinking, I sprinted for the cabin. It was a terrible idea, I knew. I was cornering myself, cutting off any chance of escape. But in that moment, all I could think about was putting a solid barrier between myself and the thing that was chasing me. I hit the door at full speed, nearly falling as it swung open with a protesting creak. I slammed it shut behind me, frantically searching for a lock. There was none. Panting heavily, I pressed my back against the door, using my body weight to hold it closed. The cabin was pitch black inside. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp, irrationally afraid that the light might somehow draw my pursuer to me. For a long moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then, from just outside, came the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I held my breath, pressing harder against the door. The footsteps completed a circuit around the small structure, then paused directly in front of the entrance. A low, curious, snuffling sound came from the other side of the door, as if the creature was scenting the air. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stood there, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear any sound of the creature's presence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out vague shapes in the cabin. An old table, a broken chair, shelves lined with dusty mason jars. When I finally convinced myself that the thing had gone, I allowed myself to relax slightly. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the dirty floor, my backpack still on, too terrified to even consider taking it off. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my fear. I woke with a start, disoriented and stiff. Pale morning light was filtering through the cabin's grimy windows. Cautiously, I got to my feet and approached one of the windows, peering out. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light. There was no sign of the creature that had chased me. Still, I waited another hour before I finally worked up the courage to open the cabin door. I stepped out slowly, every sense on high alert. But the forest was alive with normal morning sounds, birds singing, squirrels chattering. Whatever had stalked me in the night seemed to be gone. It took me most of the day to find my way back to the main trail. I was dehydrated, hungry, and covered in scratches from my panicked flight through the woods. But I was alive. As I hiked out to the nearest trail exit, my mind raced with questions. What had chased me? Why? Was it some unknown predator or something else? I'd heard stories, of course, every hiker has, about strange creatures in the wilderness. Bigfoot, Wendigos, Dogmen. I'd always laughed them off as campfire tales. Now, I wasn't so sure. I made it to a ranger station late that afternoon. The ranger on duty looked concerned when he saw the state I was in, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full story. Who would believe me? Instead, I mumbled something about getting lost and spending a rough night in the woods. As he called for a ride to take me into town, I caught a glimpse of a bulletin board behind his desk. Among the various notices and wildlife advisories, one poster caught my eye. It showed a blurry photo of a large, bipedal creature, half hidden in dense foliage. Above the image were the words, "Unusual sightings in the area. Report any strange encounters." I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it again. What could I say? That I had been chased through the woods by a monster, that something straight out of a horror movie had stalked me in one of the most popular hiking destinations in the country. In the end, I said nothing. I got my ride into town, bought a bus ticket home, and tried to put the whole terrifying experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. In my dreams, I'm back on that dark trail, with heavy footsteps following close behind, and I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that the next time I hear those footsteps, they won't stop at the cabin door. Whatever was out there in the Appalachian wilderness, I have a feeling it's still waiting, watching, and someday it might just catch up to me. Story 16. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I've seen some strange things in my time, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in Yellowstone. It was the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world. My name is Mike, and I was on duty with my partner, Sarah, when we got the call. It was late January, and the park was blanketed in snow, the kind of pristine winter wonderland that draws visitors from all over the world. But this call wasn't about tourist trouble or wildlife sightings, at least not the usual kind. "Rangers, we've got reports of strange howls coming from the Lamar Valley area," the crackling voice on the radio informed us. Probably nothing, but some campers are spooked. Can you check it out?" Sarah and I exchanged glances. Unusual animal sounds weren't uncommon in Yellowstone, but something in the dispatcher's tone made me uneasy. "Roger that," I replied. "We're on our way." We loaded up our snowmobiles and headed out into the gathering dusk. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It would have been beautiful if not for the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. As we neared the Lamar Valley, the light was fading fast. We switched on our headlamps, the beams cutting through the twilight gloom. The snow muffled the sound of our engines, creating an eerie silence when we finally cut the motors and dismounted. "Hear anything?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. I shook my head, straining my ears. The valley was quiet, too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the wildlife knew something we didn't. We trudged through the snow, our boots crunching with each step. That's when I saw them, tracks in the snow, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. "Sarah," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Take a look at this." She came over, her flashlight beam joining mine on the strange imprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of a grizzly print, with what looked like opposable thumbs. But it wasn't just their size that was unsettling. It was their shape. They were almost human-like, but distorted, as if whatever made them was only approximating a human gait. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, crouching down for a closer look. "I've never seen anything like this." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. In all my years as a ranger, I'd become an expert at identifying animal tracks. These weren't from any animal I knew. "Should we call this in?" Sarah asked, looking up at me. I hesitated. What would we say? That we'd found Bigfoot tracks. We'd be laughed out of the ranger station. "Let's follow them for a bit," I decided. "See where they lead." Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her sidearm. We rarely needed our guns in the park, but right then I was glad we had them. We followed the tracks deeper into the valley, our headlamps sweeping back and forth across the snowy landscape. The prints led us toward a copse of trees, gnarled and bare in the winter cold. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a howl. It was something in between, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah and I froze, our eyes meeting in the dim light. The sound came again, closer this time. Then we heard something else, the sharp crack of breaking wood, like a tree being snapped in half. "Mike," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I think we should go back." I nodded, slowly turning to retrace our steps. But as I swung my flashlight around, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. For a moment, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but then it moved, taking a step forward on 2 legs with a gait that was undeniably bipedal. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed beside me. The creature turned its head toward us, and I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting our flashlight beams, eyes that were far too intelligent, far too aware for any normal animal. For a long moment, we all stood frozen. Sarah and I rooted to the spot in shock and fear, the creature watching us from the tree line. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took another step forward. That broke the spell. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and turning back toward our snowmobiles. We plunged through the snow, our boots sinking deep with every step, slowing us down. I could hear heavy footfalls behind us, the sound of something large moving through the forest with far more speed and grace than should have been possible. My lungs burned in the cold air as we ran, and I resisted the urge to look back. The sounds behind us were getting closer, branches snapping, snow crunching under massive feet. We burst out of the trees back into the open valley, our snowmobiles just ahead. "Start yours up!" I yelled to Sarah as we neared them. "I'll cover you!" She nodded, sprinting for her vehicle while I turned to face the forest, drawing my sidearm. My hands shook as I aimed at the tree line, waiting for the creature to emerge, but it didn't. The forest had gone silent again, the only sound the revving of Sarah's snowmobile engine. "Mike, come on!" she shouted. I backed toward my snowmobile, gun still trained on the trees. As I swung my leg over the seat, I caught a flicker of movement in the shadows. For just a second, I saw those eyes again, watching me from the darkness. Then I gunned the engine and we were off, racing across the snowy landscape back toward the ranger station. We didn't slow down until the lights of civilization came into view, our hearts pounding in our chests. Back at the station, we sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd seen. How could we possibly report this? Who would believe us? "We have to tell someone," Sarah finally said, her voice hoarse. I nodded slowly. "But who? And what exactly do we tell them?" In the end, we filed a report about unusual tracks and strange sounds, carefully omitting any mention of the creature we'd seen. We both knew that including that would only discredit us, maybe even end our careers, but we couldn't just let it go. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I spent every spare moment researching, trying to find any similar reports or sightings. We found more than we expected. Stories of giant, ape-like creatures spotted in national parks across the country, dating back decades. Most of the scientific community dismissed these accounts as misidentification or hoaxes. But after what we'd seen, Sarah and I knew better. There was something out there, something that defied conventional explanation. We made a pact to keep watching, to stay alert for any signs of the creature's return. And return it did. Over the next year, we received more reports of strange howls and unexplained tracks. Each time, we investigated, hoping to catch another glimpse of the being we'd encountered that winter night. But it was always one step ahead of us, leaving only tantalizing clues of its presence. A tuft of coarse hair caught on a branch, massive footprints that disappeared into thin air, the unsettling feeling of being watched whenever we ventured into the more remote areas of the park. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those intelligent eyes staring at me from the darkness, as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I've come to believe that what we saw that night was no animal, at least not in the way we typically define them. It was something else, something that blurred the line between man and beast. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, a remnant of some prehistoric species, or something else entirely, but I do know this. The wilderness holds secrets that we've only begun to uncover, and sometimes, when I'm out on patrol and the shadows grow long, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half hoping, half fearing that I'll see that massive figure watching me once again, because deep down, I know it's still out there, waiting, watching. And maybe, just maybe, one day we'll be ready to understand what it really is. Story 17. I've always felt at home in the wilderness, but after what happened that night in the Pacific Northwest, I'm not sure I'll ever sleep soundly in a tent again. My name is Alex, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent years tracking and photographing some of the most elusive creatures on the planet. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, you name it. I've probably spent weeks trying to get the perfect shot of it, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in those dark woods. It was late October, and I had been camping in a remote area of the Olympic National Forest for nearly a week. I was on assignment, hoping to capture images of the Roosevelt elk during their rutting season. The weather had been unusually mild for that time of year, with clear skies and crisp, cool nights, perfect conditions for wildlife activity. I'd set up my base camp in a small clearing, with my tent, a portable blind, and several trail cameras positioned strategically around the area. It was a setup I'd used countless times before, allowing me to capture images of shy animals without disturbing them. That fateful night started like any other. I had spent the day hiking, scouting locations, and checking my cameras. As the sun began to set, I returned to my campsite, cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, and settled in for the night. I woke sometime in the early hours of the morning to the sound of something moving around my campsite. This wasn't unusual. Nighttime visitors were common, usually curious raccoons or deer investigating the lingering scent of food. Still half asleep, I unzipped my tentacrack and peered out. What I saw jolted me fully awake in an instant. My food cache, suspended high in a tree to keep it safe from bears, had been completely destroyed. The thick rope was snapped, and the container lay in pieces on the forest floor, its contents strewn about. Heart pounding, I fumbled for my flashlight. Bears were always a concern in these woods, but I had taken all the proper precautions. Whatever had done this was far stronger, and likely far larger, than any black bear I'd encountered. As I swept the beam of light around the campsite, I noticed deep impressions in the soft earth, footprints, but unlike any I'd ever seen. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with 5 distinct toes. But it wasn't just their size that unnerved me, it was their shape. They looked almost human. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my circle of light, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Something was out there, watching me. I could feel its presence like a physical weight. With shaking hands, I reached for my camera. If there was something out there, something unknown, I needed proof. As a wildlife photographer, it was almost instinctual. When faced with the extraordinary, document it. That's when I remembered my trail cameras. Whatever had raided my camp must have triggered them. Heart racing, I retrieved the nearest camera and fumbled with the memory card, slotting it into my laptop. As the images loaded, I felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in grainy night vision green, was a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It stood upright, its posture unmistakably bipedal, with long arms that nearly reached its knees. In one frame, it was reaching for my food cache, powerful muscles rippling under its fur as it effortlessly snapped the rope. In the next, its head was turned toward the camera, and I found myself staring into eyes that reflected the infrared light, eyes that seemed far too intelligent, too aware. I slammed the laptop shut, my mind reeling. What I had seen defied everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. It looked like something out of a cryptozoologist's wildest dreams, a creature that shouldn't exist. A low, rumbling sound from just outside my tent snapped me back to the present danger. Whatever I had seen in those photos was still out there, and it was close. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The canvas of my tent suddenly seemed absurdly fragile, offering no real protection from the creature outside. Seconds stretched into minutes as I sat frozen, straining my ears for any sound of movement. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of my tent zipper being pulled up. Panic surged through me. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the far side of the tent as a large, hair-covered hand pushed through the opening. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed my bear spray from beside my sleeping bag and aimed it at the tent entrance, my finger tightening on the trigger. But before I could spray, a face pushed through the opening, and I found myself staring into eyes that were undeniably, terrifyingly intelligent. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but something else, something that seemed to possess an awareness that chilled me to my core. For a long moment, we stared at each other, the creature and I, locked in a surreal standoff. I could hear its breathing, deep and ragged, could smell a musky, wild scent that filled the tent. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it withdrew. The hand disappeared, and I heard heavy footsteps moving away from the tent. I remained frozen in place, bear spray clutched in my trembling hands, for what felt like hours. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I finally worked up the courage to peer outside. The campsite was a mess, with my gear scattered about and deep footprints in the soft earth, but the creature was gone. On shaky legs, I emerged from the tent and surveyed the damage in the grey morning light. My food was gone, and one of my cameras had been smashed to pieces, but as I walked the perimeter of the camp, I noticed something that made my heart race, a tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a low-hanging branch. With trembling fingers, I carefully removed it and placed it in a small plastic bag. It was evidence, proof that what I had seen was real and not some terror-induced hallucination. I broke camp in record time, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest as I packed. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. As I hiked out, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What exactly had I encountered? Was it the legendary Bigfoot or something else entirely? And what would I do with this experience, with the evidence I carried? Part of me wanted to shout it from the rooftops, to share my incredible encounter with the world, but another part, a more cautious part, held me back. I knew how the scientific community treated such claims, knew the ridicule and disbelief I would face. In the end, I decided to keep the encounter to myself, at least for the time being. I hid the hair sample and the memory card with the creature's image in a secure location. Maybe someday, when the time was right, I would come forward with my story and my evidence, but that night changed me, altered my perception of the natural world in a fundamental way. I continued my work as a wildlife photographer, but now I looked at the wilderness with new eyes. Every shadow in the forest could be hiding something unknown. Every unexplored valley could be home to creatures we've yet to discover. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking back to that moment in the tent, to those intelligent eyes staring back at me. I wonder if, somewhere out in the vast wilderness, that creature remembers me too. The encounter left me with a profound sense of humility and wonder. We think we know so much about our world, but the truth is, there are still mysteries out there, still secrets waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky, those secrets find us. Story 18. We thought we were so clever, laughing in the face of local legends, but when that bone-chilling roar echoed through the forest, we realized our mistake. By then, it was too late. My name is Jake, and I was one of 5 friends on what was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip in the Cascade Mountains. We were all in our mid-20s, city kids with a taste for adventure, but not much real wilderness experience. Looking back, our overconfidence was our first mistake. It was early summer, and the weather was perfect for camping. We'd driven up Friday afternoon, found a secluded spot off one of the Forest Service roads, and set up our tents. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, cracking open beers and swapping stories. That's when Tyler, always the instigator of our group, got that mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey, you guys ever hear about the Bigfoot sightings in these parts?" I rolled my eyes. "Come on, man. You can't seriously believe in that stuff." "I'm just saying," Tyler grinned, taking a swig of his beer. "There's been a lot of reports around here. Weird footprints, strange noises at night. Some hikers even claim they've seen it." "Yeah, and I'm sure none of those hikers had been drinking or smoking anything," Lisa chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. We all laughed, but I noticed Megan, the quietest of our group, looking uncomfortable. "My uncle swears he saw something out here once," she said softly. "He's not the type to make stuff up." "Oh, come on," I groaned. "Not you too, Meg. It's just stories people tell to scare tourists and sell T-shirts." "I don't know," said Chris, always the voice of reason in our group. "There's a lot of wilderness out here. Who knows what could be living in these mountains?" Tyler's grin widened. "Only one way to find out," he said, standing up. Before any of us could stop him, he cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a loud, ape-like howl that echoed through the trees. "Tyler!" Lisa hissed, looking around nervously. "Shut up! You'll attract bears or something." "Or Bigfoot," he laughed, dropping back into his camp chair. We all chuckled, the tension broken. The conversation moved on to other topics: work, relationships, plans for the future, but there was an undercurrent of unease now, a prickle at the back of my neck that I couldn't quite shake. As the fire burned low and the night grew late, we decided to turn in. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, Chris and Lisa in one, Tyler and Megan in another, and me in my small solo tent. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a roar, deep and guttural, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This was something else entirely. Something that sent primal fear coursing through my veins. For a moment, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, hoping I'd imagined it. Then I heard panicked whispers from the other tents, and I knew it had been real. "Did you guys hear that?" Tyler's voice, all traces of his earlier bravado gone. "What the hell was it?" Lisa, her words tight with fear. Another roar split the night, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, branches snapping under heavy footfalls. "Everyone stay in your tents," Chris called out, trying to sound calm but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it on. The beam of light seemed pathetically small in the vast darkness outside my tent. That's when I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, hovering at a height that no normal animal could reach. They were just beyond the edge of our campsite, partially obscured by the trees, but unmistakably there. A whimper escaped my throat before I could stop it. The eyes blinked, then slowly began to move closer. "Guys," I whispered, my voice hoarse with terror. "There's something out there. I can see its eyes." "Oh, God," Megan sobbed from her tent. "What do we do?" The thing, whatever it was, let out another roar. It was so loud, so close, that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. The eyes were moving steadily closer, and now I could make out a massive, shadowy shape behind them. Panic overtook me. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent, nearly falling in my haste to get out. I could hear the others doing the same, all pretense of staying put forgotten in the face of the approaching creature. We huddled together in the center of the campsite, flashlights darting wildly around us. In the fragmentary light, I caught glimpses of something that defied belief, a huge, hair-covered body, long arms that nearly reached the ground, a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. "Holy shit," Tyler breathed beside me. "It's real. It's actually real." The creature stepped fully into the clearing, and we all gasped. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with muscles rippling under its thick fur. Its eyes, now that I could see them clearly, were disturbingly intelligent, filled with an awareness that seemed almost human. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, the creature and us, locked in a surreal standoff. Then Chris, always the level-headed one, spoke in a low, calm voice. "Nobody move, nobody run, just stay still." The creature tilted its head, as if considering Chris's words. Then it took another step forward, and another, closing the distance between us with frightening speed. Megan screamed, and that broke the spell. We scattered, running blindly into the dark forest. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush around me and behind us, the sound of the creature in pursuit. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, and my heart felt like it would burst from my chest, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety. Eventually, I burst out onto a gravel road, the Forest Service road we'd driven in on. I turned and saw Lisa and Tyler stumbling out of the trees nearby. Chris emerged a moment later, half carrying a sobbing Megan. "The car," Chris gasped. "We need to get to the car." We ran down the road, praying we were going in the right direction. Behind us, we could hear crashing in the forest, as if something large was paralleling our course just out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, we rounded a bend and saw our SUV parked where we'd left it. We piled in, Chris fumbling with the keys as the rest of us urged him to hurry. The engine roared to life just as a massive shape burst from the tree line. In the headlights, we got our clearest view yet of the creature. The broad, sloped forehead, the deep-set eyes, the powerful jaw. It let out one final earth-shaking roar as Chris floored the accelerator, spraying gravel as we fishtailed onto the road. We drove in shocked silence, no one daring to speak until we hit the main highway. Even then, we only exchanged disbelieving glances, as if afraid that talking about what we'd seen might somehow make it follow us. It wasn't until we were safely back in the city, huddled in Chris and Lisa's apartment, that we finally began to process what had happened. We talked until dawn, trying to make sense of our encounter, debating whether to tell anyone. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us? We had no proof, nothing but our own terrified testimonies. We knew how it would sound, a group of friends, out drinking in the woods, claiming to have seen Bigfoot. We'd be laughed out of town, but we knew what we'd seen. That night changed us all, altered our perception of the world in a fundamental way. We'd come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. I still go camping sometimes, still enjoy the outdoors, but now, when night falls and the forest grows dark, I find myself listening more closely to the sounds around me. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I could swear I hear a distant, familiar roar echoing through the trees. It's a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, if you're not careful, those mysteries might just find you. Story 19. The scent hit me first, a nauseating mix of decay and wet fur that made my stomach lurch. Then came the sound of twigs snapping behind me. As I turned, time seemed to slow, and I found myself face to face with something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. My name is Emily, and I've been a search and rescue volunteer for the past 5 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that fateful day in the dense forests of northern Minnesota. It was early November, and the air had a crisp bite to it. The trees stood bare, their leaves long since fallen, creating a stark, almost eerie landscape. We'd received a call about a missing hiker, a 28-year-old man named Mark, who had gone out for a day hike 3 days ago and never returned. As the newest member of our SAR team, I was often given the more remote areas to search. This time, I was assigned a section of the forest that was rarely traversed, even by experienced hikers. The terrain was rough, with steep ravines and dense underbrush that made progress slow and tedious. I'd been searching for hours, calling out Mark's name at regular intervals and scanning the ground for any signs of recent human activity. The forest was unnaturally quiet, with none of the usual chattering of birds or rustling of small animals. It set my nerves on edge, though I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I was about to call it quits and head back to base camp when I spotted something that made me pause. There, caught on a low-hanging branch, was a scrap of bright blue fabric, the same color as the jacket Mark had been reported wearing. My heart raced as I approached, hoping this might be the break we needed, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. The fabric wasn't just torn, it was shredded, as if something with incredible strength had ripped it apart. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked almost human, two-legged and walking upright, but they were far too large, easily twice the size of my own boot prints. And there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the strange footprints were long, deep gouges in the earth, as if whatever had made them had claws. I radioed back to base camp, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported finding potential evidence. But before I could give my location, the radio crackled and went dead. I was on my own. Common sense told me to mark the location and head back, to return with the full team in the daylight. But something, curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe just plain foolishness, made me want to investigate further. I followed the tracks, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the forest floor. They led me deeper into the woods, to areas I was sure no hiker would voluntarily venture. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little remaining daylight there was. That's when I found the first body. It wasn't Mark. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The carcass had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open and picked clean, but it wasn't the work of normal predators. The bones were snapped and splintered in ways that spoke of impossible strength. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to retch. As I stumbled backward, my foot caught on something. I looked down and felt my heart stop. Half buried in the leaves was a human hand, the flesh grey and mottled. With trembling fingers, I brushed away the leaves, revealing more of the body. It was Mark, or what remained of him. His clothes were in tatters, and his body bore the same terrible wounds as the deer. I scrambled backward, my mind reeling. What could have done this? A bear, a pack of wolves, but I knew, deep down, that no normal animal was responsible for what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither growl nor roar, but something in between. It raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a primal jolt of fear through my body. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and there, at the edge of the small clearing, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly brushing the low-hanging branches. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over protruding bones, but still radiating an aura of terrible strength. Matted fur covered parts of its body, and its hands ended in long, wicked claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with sunken eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. And there, sprouting from its skull, was a rack of antlers like those of a massive stag. In that moment, all the old stories I'd heard as a child came rushing back, tales of the Wendigo, the cannibalistic spirit of the northern forests. I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales meant to scare children. Now, faced with the reality, I felt my sanity begin to fray. The creature took a step forward, its movement unnaturally fluid for something of its size. The stench of decay grew stronger, and I could hear its ragged breathing, see the vapor curling from its mouth in the cold air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that any sudden movement would trigger its predatory response. So I stood, rooted to the spot, as it took another step closer, its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of malevolent hunger wash over me. This wasn't just a predator seeking prey. There was an intelligence behind those eyes, a cruel, calculating awareness that was all too human. In that moment, I understood why Mark had ventured so far off the trail, why he hadn't been found, despite days of searching. The Wendigo hadn't just killed him. It had lured him here, played with him like a cat with a mouse, and now it had a new toy. As if reading my thoughts, the creature's mouth split into a terrible grin, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. It raised one clawed hand, reaching for me with agonizing slowness, as if savoring my terror. The spell broke. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Behind me, I heard an otherworldly shriek and the sound of something large in pursuit. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but pure terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety. Eventually, I burst out onto a gravel road, one of the Forest Service roads that crisscrossed the area. I turned, half expecting to see the creature right behind me. But the forest was quiet, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Had I lost it, or was it simply toying with me, letting me think I'd escaped? I didn't wait to find out. I ran down the road, praying I was going in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of our base camp. I burst into the camp, wild-eyed and babbling. My teammates rushed to me, asking what had happened, where I'd been. But how could I explain? Who would believe me? In the end, I told them about finding Mark's body, about the strange tracks and the shredded clothing. I left out any mention of the creature I'd seen. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew how it would sound, an inexperienced volunteer, lost in the woods, letting her imagination run wild. A search party was sent out at first light to recover Mark's body, but when they reached the area I described, they found nothing. No body, no tracks, no sign that anything unusual had happened there at all. I left the search and rescue team soon after. I couldn't bear the pitying looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. They all thought I'd cracked under the pressure, invented a story to cope with the trauma of finding a body. But I know what I saw. On dark nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I find myself thinking back to those glowing eyes, that skeletal face with its crown of antlers, and I wonder, is it still out there, waiting in the dark forests of the north? And who will be its next victim? The wilderness holds secrets, some of which are better left undiscovered, but once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than most people realize, and sometimes the monsters from our oldest stories turn out to be all too real. Story 20. The woods have eyes. I know because I've seen them, glowing, intelligent, and undeniably inhuman. What I encountered that night in northern Michigan wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of legends and nightmares. My name is Tom, and I've been a hunter for most of my life. Growing up in rural Michigan, I spent countless hours in the forests, tracking deer and learning the ways of the wild. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But that autumn night showed me how wrong I was, how little I truly understood about the dark heart of the wilderness. It was the second week of deer season, and my buddy Mike and I had set up our hunting camp deep in the Huron National Forest. We'd been coming to this same spot for years, drawn by the abundant game and the isolation. This year, though, something felt different from the moment we arrived. The forest was too quiet. No chattering squirrels, no birdsong, not even the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath, waiting for something to happen. We shrugged it off at first, blaming the unusual silence on the unseasonably warm weather. But as the sun began to set on our second day in camp, we heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It started as a low, mournful sound, almost like a wolf's howl, but different, deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent a shiver down my spine. Mike and I exchanged glances, both of us instinctively reaching for our rifles. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his eyes scanning the darkening tree line. I shook my head, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Probably just a coyote," I said, not believing it for a second. "Sound carries weird out here sometimes," but deep down I knew this was something else. In all my years in these woods, I'd never heard anything like it. As if to confirm my fears, the sound came again, closer this time. It was followed by a series of sharp cracks, the unmistakable sound of branches breaking under the weight of something large moving through the forest. We doused our campfire and retreated to the relative safety of our hunting blind, a small elevated platform we'd built in a sturdy oak tree. As we climbed, I caught a whiff of something that turned my stomach, a rank, musky odor, unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. From our perch in the tree, we scanned the forest with our rifle scopes, looking for any sign of movement. The woods had gone deadly quiet again, the only sound our own shallow breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of our camp. I adjusted my scope, trying to get a better look, and felt my blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a large pine, was a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, much taller than any man. with a broad, powerful build covered in dark fur. But it wasn't a bear. This thing was standing upright on two legs, its posture unmistakably bipedal. As I watched, frozen in shock and disbelief, it turned its head and looked directly at our blind. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes reflecting the moonlight, glowing with an intelligence that was far too human. "Mike," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "are you seeing this?" He nodded slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. What is that thing?" Before I could answer, the creature moved. It was fast, impossibly so for something of its size. In 2 long strides, it crossed our campsite and was at the base of our tree. We held our breath, neither of us daring to move as the thing circled the oak, its clawed hands leaving deep gouges in the bark. It was so close now that I could hear its breathing, deep, ragged pants that sent waves of that foul odor wafting up to our position. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to climb the tree, but then it paused, lifting its head to sniff the air. Its face, now clearly visible in the moonlight, was like something out of a nightmare, a bizarre mix of wolf and man, with a long snout filled with sharp teeth and eyes that burned with an unnatural intelligence. It let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very wood of our blind, then turned and loped back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. Mike and I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sound of the creature's return. When we finally worked up the courage to speak, it was in hushed whispers, as if afraid that talking about what we'd seen might somehow summon it back. "What the hell was that?" Mike asked again, his voice shaky. I shook my head, my mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. "I don't know, man. I've never seen anything like it." But even as I said the words, old stories began to surface in my memory. Tales I'd heard as a kid, legends whispered around campfires about a creature that stalked the forests of the Upper Peninsula. The locals had a name for it, Dogman. I'd always dismissed those stories as tall tales, the kind of thing old-timers made up to scare tourists and keep kids out of the woods at night. But now, faced with the evidence of my own eyes, I wasn't so sure. We spent a sleepless night in that blind, jumping at every sound, our rifles at the ready. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we finally worked up the courage to climb down and inspect our camp. The scene that greeted us confirmed that the night's events hadn't been some shared hallucination. Our tents were shredded, our supplies scattered. Deep claw marks scored the trees around the campsite, some of them a good 8 feet off the ground. But the most chilling evidence was the tracks. They were everywhere, pressed deep into the soft earth, massive, canine-like prints, but with an unmistakably human aspect to them. They were easily twice the size of my own boot print, with clear impressions of sharp claws at the end of each toe. Mike and I exchanged glances, both of us coming to the same unspoken decision. Without a word, we began packing up what remained of our gear, eager to put as much distance between ourselves and this place as possible. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me whirl around, half expecting to see that nightmarish face leering at us from the shadows. We were nearly finished loading the truck when we heard it again, that same unearthly howl that had first heralded the creature's arrival. It was distant this time, but unmistakable, and it wasn't alone. From deeper in the forest came an answering call, then another and another. We didn't wait to hear more. We piled into the truck and peeled out of there, gravel spraying as we fishtailed onto the forest road. In the rear-view mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the tree line, a large, dark shape melting back into the shadows. The drive home was tense and silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were safely back in town, nursing beers at the local bar, that we finally began to process what had happened. "We can't tell anyone about this," Mike said, his voice low. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, knowing he was right. Who would believe us? We had no proof, nothing but our own terrified testimonies and a campsite we'd abandoned in our haste to escape. We'd be laughed out of town, our reputations as experienced woodsmen ruined. But I knew what I'd seen. That night changed everything for me, altered my perception of the world in a fundamental way. The forests I'd once seen as a second home now held a darker mystery, a primal danger I'd never fully appreciated before. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods. But now, when twilight falls and the shadows lengthen, I find myself listening more closely to the sounds around me. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I could swear I hear a distant howl echoing through the trees, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight, waiting. The Michigan Dogman is more than just a legend. It's out there, watching and waiting. And God help anyone who ventures too deep into its domain. Story 21. The moon was full the night I came face to face with a monster. Not the kind from childhood nightmares or horror movies, but something far more terrifying because it was real. My name is Rachel, and I've been a Forest Service worker in Northern California for the past 7 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Wildfires, lost hikers, the occasional bear encounter. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. It was late June, and we'd been getting reports of illegal camping activity in a remote area of the forest. Normally, we'd send out a team to investigate, but we were short-staffed due to a large wildfire in the southern part of the state. So, I volunteered to do a solo reconnaissance mission. It was a decision I would come to regret. I set out just before dusk, my patrol truck bumping along the winding forest roads. The sun was setting as I reached the trailhead, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, but as I shouldered my pack and flashlight, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest was unnaturally quiet as I hiked deeper into the wilderness. No chirping of birds settling down for the night. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woodland was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After about an hour of hiking, I reached the area where the illegal camping had been reported. What I found stopped me in my tracks. The campsite, if you could call it that, looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Tents were shredded, sleeping bags torn to pieces and strewn about. What had once been a campfire was now just a scattered pile of ashes and charred wood. But it wasn't the destruction that sent a chill down my spine. It was the claw marks. Deep gouges scored the trees surrounding the campsite, some of them a good 8 feet off the ground. These weren't the marks of any bear or mountain lion I'd ever seen. They were too big, too high up, and there was an almost deliberate quality to them, as if whatever had made them wanted to send a message. I keyed my radio, intending to call for backup, but all I got was static. I was on my own. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a sound broke the eerie silence. A long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. This was something else entirely, something that made my blood run cold. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness. That's when I saw the tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my boot print, with clear impressions of sharp claws at the end of each toe. But it wasn't just their size that unnerved me. They were bipedal. Whatever had made them had been walking on 2 legs. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe, standing on its hind legs. But I knew that wasn't right. These tracks spoke of something that moved habitually on 2 feet, something with a gait that was almost human. Another howl split the night air. Closer this time, I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light, glowing an eerie yellow-green. But when I looked again, they were gone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to my truck and out of these woods as fast as I could. But I was a Forest Service worker, trained to handle emergencies. If there were campers out here in danger, I had a duty to find them. So, against my better judgment, I pressed on, following the strange tracks deeper into the forest. The full moon had risen, casting an otherworldly glow through the trees. Shadows seemed to move and shift in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. That's when I smelled it, a rank, musky odor that turned my stomach. It was like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, so strong I could almost taste it. And it was getting stronger. I heard a twig snap behind me and whirled around, my flashlight illuminating a scene straight out of a nightmare. There, not 20 feet away, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs, its posture unmistakably bipedal. Its face was a horrifying blend of wolf and man, with a long snout filled with sharp teeth and eyes that burned with an intelligence that was far too human. Those eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of primal terror wash over me. This wasn't just an animal. There was a cruel, calculating awareness behind that gaze. For a long moment, we stood frozen, the creature and I, locked in a surreal standoff. Then it took a step forward, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me, moving with impossible speed for something of its size. Its breathing, deep and ragged, seemed to be right at my heels. I don't know how long I ran, or in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but sheer terror kept me moving. Finally, mercifully, I burst out onto a gravel road, one of the Forest Service roads that crisscrossed the area. I turned, half expecting to see the creature right behind me. But the forest was quiet, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Had I lost it, or was it simply toying with me, letting me think I'd escaped? I didn't wait to find out. I ran down the road, praying I was going in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the reflective glint of my truck's license plate in the moonlight. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I climbed in and started the engine, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a large, dark shape at the edge of the tree line. It raised its head and let out a bone-chilling howl that seemed to vibrate through the very frame of the truck. I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying as I fishtailed onto the main road. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway, the bright lights of civilization never looking so welcoming. Back at the ranger station, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd seen. How could I possibly report this? Who would believe me? Even as the words formed in my mind, I knew how it would sound. An overstressed Forest Service worker, alone in the woods at night, letting her imagination run wild. In the end, I filed a report about finding an abandoned campsite that had been ravaged by an unknown large predator. I left out any mention of the creature I'd seen. Even as I typed the words, I knew I was covering up something monumental, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. But I also knew that going public with what I'd seen would end my career. I'd be laughed out of the Forest Service, my reputation ruined, and deep down, part of me didn't want to share what I'd discovered. The world felt safer, somehow, believing that such creatures didn't exist. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into researching local legends and folklore. I found stories of the Dogman, a werewolf-like creature said to haunt the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Stories I'd always dismissed as campfire tales suddenly took on a chilling new significance. I still work for the Forest Service, still spend my days in the woods. But now, when twilight falls and the shadows lengthen, I find myself listening more closely to the sounds around me, and sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I could swear I hear a distant howl echoing through the trees. It's a reminder that the wilderness holds secrets, some of which are better left undiscovered. But once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than most people realize, and sometimes the monsters from our oldest stories turn out to be all too real.